It started with the map, you know, the kind of folded-up disaster your grandparents might have used. We'd found it at a gas station off I-90 in the middle of nowhere, tucked behind a rack of souvenir mugs and dream catchers. The clerk didn't even know it was there, said it had been stuck back there forever. But it had something none of our GPS apps did. This faint snaking road that cut through miles of dense forest and would save us hours getting to the cabin. Seemed like a good idea at the time. The road started normal enough, gravel crunching under the tires, trees casting long shadows in the fading daylight. It wasn't until the first hairpin turn that I noticed something off. The GPS showed us as nowhere, a blank expanse where the road should have been. But hey, old back roads mess with signal, right? We kept going. Then, the fog rolled in. Not a light, wispy fog either. It was the thick, soupy kind that clings to your skin and makes your headlights useless. We slowed to a crawl, the car creeping forward as the world closed in around us. That's when I saw it, a shape on the side of the road. At first I thought it was a deer, standing dead still in the fog, but as we got closer I realized it wasn't moving. It was a sign, a battered wooden one, leaning at an angle, like it had been abandoned for decades. It read, "Turn back." We laughed it off. Of course we did. Probably some local messing with tourists, I said, though I didn't feel as confident as I sounded. My friend in the passenger seat, let's call him Joe, didn't laugh. He was gripping the door handle, like it was the only thing keeping him from bolting. Joe didn't laugh because Joe saw something else. I didn't notice it at first, too focused on the sign, but he was staring into the trees past the fog, unblinking. His lips moved, mouthing something I couldn't hear over the engine. "What?" I asked, trying to keep the mood light. "You see Bigfoot or something?" He didn't answer. His face was pale, his eyes wide. I glanced at where he was looking and slammed the brakes. There was a figure. Standing just beyond the edge of the road, half obscured by the mist, was someone or something just watching us. They were tall, unnaturally so, and draped in something dark and ragged. It could have been a coat, maybe a tarp, but it didn't move right. The edges fluttered, though there wasn't any wind. I couldn't see their face, just the faint outline of a head that seemed wrong, misshapen. Then they stepped back into the fog, disappearing as quickly as they'd appeared. "What the hell was that?" Joe finally whispered, his voice shaking. "Probably just a hiker," I said, but even I didn't believe it. Who hikes out here, in the middle of nowhere, at dusk? And why were they staring like that? The tires spun a little as I hit the gas, the gravel scattering behind us. The road ahead twisted sharply, snaking like it had been carved out by a drunk surveyor. The fog thickened, clinging to the windshield no matter how high I cranked the wipers. My palms were sweating, but I kept driving. Stopping didn't feel like an option anymore. Joe hadn't taken his eyes off the woods. "They're still there," he muttered, so quietly I almost didn't hear him. "What?" "They're following us." I didn't want to look, but I did. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement. Dark, fleeting shapes darting between the trees, just keeping pace with the car. They didn't look like animals. Too tall, too fast, too human. But not quite. "Keep going," Joe said, his voice rising now. "Don't stop." I didn't need convincing. The road got worse, narrowing and eroding, until it barely felt like a road at all. The trees seemed to close in, their branches arching overhead like skeletal fingers. I could feel the car struggling, the undercarriage scraping against unseen roots and rocks. That's when the noise started. It was faint at first, like whispers carried on the wind. Joe heard it too, his head snapping toward me. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, gripping the wheel tighter. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a garbled mess of sounds. Words? Maybe. But they didn't make any sense. It felt like they were inside the car, inside my head, crawling under my skin. Then the headlights flickered. No, 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 I muttered, slamming my palm against the dashboard. The lights came back, but only barely, casting a weak, yellowish glow that did nothing to cut through the fog. I felt like we were driving blind, and then we weren't alone. The figure was in the road. It stood dead center, blocking our path. This time, there was no mistaking it. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its posture unnatural, bent like it was being pulled by invisible strings. The head tilted sharply as we approached, jerking from side to side as if it was studying us. "Floor it," Joe yelled, panic rising in his voice. I hesitated. Everything in me screamed to stop, to turn around. But where could we go? Back toward the things in the woods? So I hit the gas. The figure didn't move. Not until the very last second. Then it stepped aside with a speed that defied logic, its body twisting unnaturally as it disappeared into the trees. We didn't slow down, didn't speak. The road seemed endless, stretching on forever as the whispers faded and the fog finally began to lift. Relief washed over me as the gravel gave way to smooth asphalt, and the familiar glow of distant streetlights appeared on the horizon. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest gas station. Under the harsh fluorescence, it felt safe, normal. Joe got out, pacing and swearing under his breath. I just sat there, gripping the wheel, my knuckles white. "You saw that, right?" I finally said. "Tell me I'm not crazy." Joe stopped pacing, looking me dead in the eye. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I saw it." Neither of us mentioned the scratches on the roof of the car. 3 long parallel gashes that hadn't been there before. And we sure as hell didn't talk about the map, the one we'd left in the car. That was now blank. It started like most road trips do. Too much caffeine, terrible gas station snacks, and hours of nothing but open road and staticky radio stations. I was headed west, chasing a bucket list idea of driving cross-country before I hit 30. Alone. It wasn't my first solo trip, but it was definitely shaping up to be the longest. I was somewhere in Colorado, deep in the mountains, when I saw the first sign of trouble. A literal sign. The battered roadside marker read, Pine Hollow, population 72. It wasn't on my GPS. I figured it was one of those blink-and-you-miss-it places, barely more than a cluster of houses and a gas station. But my fuel gauge was flirting with empty, so I decided to make the detour. The town was only a few miles off the highway, tucked in a valley that the sun seemed to avoid entirely. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not peaceful silence, but the kind that made your skin crawl. There were no birds, no wind, not even the distant hum of insects. Just my engine's low rumble and the crunch of gravel under my tires as I pulled into a crooked gas station at the edge of town. The gas station looked like it hadn't been updated since the early 80s. Faded signs advertised brands that probably didn't exist anymore. The pumps were ancient, the kind you'd expect to see in an antique store, rather than a functioning station. Still, I had no choice. I parked and stepped out, already regretting the detour. A bell jingled as I pushed open the door to the station's convenience store. The air inside was heavy, almost sour, like something had been spilled and never cleaned up. A single old man stood behind the counter. He was pale, gaunt, and completely still. So much so that for a moment, I thought he was a mannequin. But his eyes tracked me as I walked in, unblinking and bloodshot. "Just gas," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Pump 3. He didn't respond. He just stared for an uncomfortable beat before nodding once. I handed him my card, but he didn't take it. Instead, he pointed to an old cash register. Taped to it was a handwritten sign, "Cash only." I sighed, digging through my wallet. I didn't carry much cash, but thankfully I had enough to fill half a tank. The old man rang up the sale in complete silence, then handed me a single crumpled receipt. His fingers were ice cold when they brushed mine. As I turned to leave, he spoke for the first time. His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't used it in years. "Don't stay here too long." That should have been enough to send me running, but I was too focused on the gas. I went back to my car, filled up, and checked my GPS again. Still no signal. I decided to drive through the town to see if I could find a cell tower, or at least get my bearings. The further I drove into Pine Hollow, the stranger it became. The streets were lined with small, identical houses, all of them dark. No porch lights, no signs of life. Every window was either boarded up or covered with heavy curtains. I didn't see a single person, just a few stray cars parked along the cracked sidewalks. As I rounded a corner, I spotted movement, a single figure standing under a flickering street lamp. It was a woman in a tattered dress, her back to me. Her shoulders were hunched, and she was clutching something in her hands, a bundle wrapped in cloth. I slowed down, rolling my window down halfway. "Hey, do you need help?" I called out. She didn't respond. Instead, she let out a low, guttural sob and turned toward me. That's when I saw her face. Her eyes were hollow, dark pits, and her mouth was stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. The bundle in her hands fell to the ground, unwrapping as it hit the pavement. It wasn't a bundle. It was a doll. A filthy, mangled doll missing an arm and both its eyes. Panic shot through me, and I slammed on the gas, speeding past her. In my rearview mirror, I saw her drop to her knees and start crawling toward my car, fast, her fingers clawing at the asphalt. I made it back to the highway, heart pounding, telling myself over and over that it was just some crazy woman. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That feeling only got worse when I passed the same battered sign I'd seen on my way in. Pine Hollow, population 72. I swore I'd just left the town, but there it was again. The same gas station, the same crooked pumps. My hands were shaking as I pulled over and checked my GPS again. Still nothing. The highway stretched out behind me, but somehow it had led me right back to Pine Hollow. I couldn't stay here. I refused. I hit the gas and sped past the sign, driving for what felt like hours. But no matter how far I went, the town always reappeared, waiting for me like a spider at the center of its web. The last time I drove through, something had changed. There were more people now, standing along the streets. They all looked like the woman I'd seen earlier, grinning faces, hollow eyes. They didn't move or speak, just stared at my car as I passed. And every time I glanced in my rearview mirror, they were closer, their numbers growing. Finally, I pulled into the gas station one last time, desperate and out of options. The old man was still there, standing behind the counter, his bloodshot eyes locked onto mine as I stormed inside. "What's happening here?" I demanded. "How do I leave?" He didn't answer. He just stared at me with that same hollow expression. Then slowly, he raised his hand and pointed to a door at the back of the store. I don't know why I listened. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe I was just too tired to fight anymore. I walked to the door and opened it, stepping into complete darkness. I don't remember much after that. Just flashes. Twisting hallways, deafening whispers, hands clawing at me from the shadows. When I finally woke up, I was sitting in my car, parked on the side of the highway. My gas tank was full, and the town was gone. I've tried to find Pine Hollow on a map since then, but it doesn't exist. No one I've talked to has ever heard of it. Sometimes I wonder if it was just a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But then I remember the doll, still sitting in my back seat, staring at me with its eyeless face. And the next time I hit the open road, I'll make damn sure I don't take any detours. I should have known better than to take that highway. It wasn't even on the map, just a dusty stretch of cracked asphalt that veered off Interstate 40, promising a quicker route. The gas station attendant warned me, his face pale beneath the flickering neon light. "Don't take Route 33 after dark," he'd muttered, barely meeting my eye. But time wasn't on my side, and the idea of shaving 2 hours off my road trip seemed like a blessing. The first few miles were fine. The radio buzzed with static, the moon hung low and bright, and the silence out there, in the middle of nowhere, felt almost peaceful. Almost. Then I saw the figure. At first I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the moonlight playing on the jagged outlines of the trees lining the road. But it was moving. Stumbling, actually, toward the middle of the highway. A man, waving his arms frantically as I drew closer. His shirt was torn, and his face was streaked with something dark that looked suspiciously like blood. "Help me. Please." His voice cracked, audible even through the closed windows of my car. Against my better judgment, I slowed down. Big mistake. I rolled the window down just a crack. "What's going on?" I called out. The man staggered closer, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "You have to turn around, now." His voice was desperate, raw with fear. "It's coming." "What's coming?" My words felt hollow, ridiculous. The road was silent except for the whisper of wind and the distant chirping of crickets. He didn't answer. Instead, his gaze snapped over his shoulder, toward the dark expanse of road behind him. That's when I noticed the sound. Faint at first, like a low hum, growing steadily louder. It was mechanical, rhythmic, like an engine. But wrong. Before I could process it, the man yanked open my passenger door and threw himself inside. "Drive," he shouted, slamming the door shut. "If you don't want to die, drive." Every instinct told me to kick him out, but something in his voice froze me. I stomped on the gas. The tires screeched as the car lurched forward, the headlights slicing through the night. "What the hell is going on?" I yelled, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. "It's hunting," he whispered, his voice trembling. I barely got away. Saw it rip my buddy apart like he was nothing. "What did you see?" He hesitated, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the seatbelt. "You'll see soon enough." I wanted to press him further, but the sound was back. That low, vibrating hum, closer now. I checked the rearview mirror and saw nothing but darkness, yet the hum grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like the car itself was vibrating. Then I saw the headlights. At least, I thought they were headlights at first. Two bright circular beams in the distance growing larger, brighter, as they closed the gap between us. But there was something off. They weren't steady. They flickered, danced almost, as if alive. "It's found us," the man breathed, sinking lower in his seat. I pushed the pedal to the floor. The speedometer climbed. 80, 90, 100. The car rattled, every bump on the road threatening to send us skidding. But no matter how fast I went, the lights behind us kept pace. Then they split. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the lights were moving independently now, darting side to side like a pair of eyes tracking prey. The hum grew louder, almost deafening, and my chest tightened with an inexplicable sense of dread. "It's not a car," the man whispered. "What?" I shouted. "It's not a car!" he screamed, his voice breaking. "It's them!" I didn't have time to ask what he meant, because the lights surged forward, impossibly fast, and I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. A shape, black and spindly, riding low to the ground. Its movements were jerky, insect-like, yet unnervingly deliberate. And it wasn't alone. The lights weren't just behind us anymore. They were on both sides, weaving in and out of the trees like predators circling their prey. My hands shook as I struggled to keep the car steady. "What do we do?" I screamed. "Don't stop. Whatever you do, don't stop," he said, his voice barely audible over the hum. "They only take you if you stop." Suddenly, one of the lights veered sharply, slamming into the car with a deafening thud. The vehicle lurched sideways, nearly skidding off the road. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. "They're playing with us," the man said, his face pale as a ghost. I didn't answer. My focus was locked on the road ahead, scanning desperately for any sign of escape. That's when I saw it. A bridge, narrow and ancient-looking, spanning a deep gorge. "Hold on!" I shouted, aiming for the bridge. The car roared onto the wooden planks, the structure groaning under the weight. The lights followed, but something changed. As we crossed, the hum grew more erratic, the lights flickering violently. "They don't like the water," the man muttered, his eyes wide with realization. "Get to the other side." I floored it. The lights hesitated, lingering at the edge of the bridge, their glow dimming. For the first time, hope flared in my chest. But just as we reached the far side, a loud crack split the air. The bridge was collapsing. The car shot off the end just as the planks behind us gave way, plunging into the darkness below. We skidded to a stop on solid ground, the engine sputtering. For a moment, everything was silent. The hum was gone. The man exhaled shakily, running a hand through his sweat-soaked hair. "You're lucky," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Most people don't get away." I turned to him, ready to demand answers, but he was already getting out of the car. "Where are you going?" I called after him. He didn't look back. "Don't take shortcuts," he said, disappearing into the trees. I sat there for a long time, staring at the ruined bridge and the dark road beyond it. Eventually, I started the car and drove back the way I came. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if the lights were still there. The evening air was thick with the smell of wet hay and the faint metallic tang of old tools. The wind carried a strange, almost melodic whistling sound that seemed to rise and fall, as if it was alive and moving just beyond the edge of the cornfield. That's where I was, alone on my grandfather's farm for the weekend. He'd left a list of chores, but I was mostly there to keep an eye on the livestock. Easy enough. It started with the chickens. Around midnight, I heard them squawking, not their usual restless chatter, but a frenzied, chaotic scream that shot me bolt upright in bed. Grabbing the flashlight by the door, I shoved my feet into my boots and headed out. The barnyard was quiet, except for the frantic rustling inside the coop. When I opened the door, my stomach twisted. Something had ripped through the chicken wire, leaving a gaping hole. Feathers floated in the air like soft snow, and the floor was littered with streaks of blood. There were no tracks outside, just the hole and the silence. Too much silence. Even the frogs in the pond weren't croaking. I convinced myself it was a fox or maybe a coyote, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. By 2 a.m., the rain started, a steady, cold drizzle. I was lying in bed, staring at the wooden beams above me, when the faint sound of movement reached my ears. It wasn't coming from the house, but from somewhere outside. It was a low, dragging sound, punctuated by wet thuds, as if something heavy was being pulled through the mud. I hesitated for too long before grabbing the shotgun from the rack. As I stepped outside, the rain soaked me instantly, plastering my shirt to my skin. The sound was louder now. It was coming from the silo. The old wooden structure loomed ahead, its weathered planks dark against the stormy sky. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe the rain, knocking loose a tarp. But as I approached, the dragging sound stopped. I swung the flashlight beam towards the base of the silo. That's when I saw it. A figure was hunched over the pile of spilled corn, its arms long and bony, the skin stretched tight over sharp joints. Its back was to me, but its movements were jerky and wrong, like a puppet with tangled strings. I froze, the beam of light shaking as my hands trembled. Whatever it was, it turned its head slowly, unnaturally far, until its face was visible in profile. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth impossibly wide, filled with rows of teeth that looked more like shards of broken glass. It grinned, a thin, split-lipped smile that made my knees buckle. And then it stood. It was tall, too tall. It had to duck as it turned fully towards me. In its clawed hand, it held a chicken, what was left of one. It dropped the carcass, and the wet thud echoed in the silence. The thing started towards me, its movements fluid now, almost hypnotic. I ran. The mud sucked at my boots as I sprinted back to the house. I didn't dare look back, not even when I heard the wet slapping of its footsteps gaining on me. By the time I reached the door, I was screaming. I slammed it shut, bolting the lock and shoving the kitchen table against it for good measure. The footsteps stopped just outside. The porch creaked as it stepped up, and I could hear it sniffing, the sound wet and guttural. Then, nothing. I stayed up the rest of the night, the shotgun cradled in my arms, the flashlight trained on the door. It didn't return. Not that night. But the farm wasn't the same after that. Strange things kept happening. The cows refused to graze near the silo, and I found deep clawed marks gouged into the barn doors. And every night, without fail, that melodic whistling would drift through the air, growing louder as it approached the house. I left that farm the next morning, my chores undone. I never told my grandfather what happened. I didn't have to. When he called me weeks later, his voice was shaking. He said something was out there, something that didn't belong. He never saw it, but he heard the whistling. He sold the farm not long after that. Last I heard, the new owners abandoned it after their son disappeared. They said he was playing near the silo. I know better. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that I left the farm and the horrors stayed there, tied to the land like a bad dream. But things like that don't let go so easily. They follow you. They linger. A few months after I left, I moved to the city, hoping the crowded streets and constant hum of life would drown out the memories. It worked for a while. I even started sleeping better, the image of that grinning, hollow-eyed thing fading with time. Then, one night, I heard it again. I was walking home late, my breath fogging in the chilly air. The streets were empty, the kind of quiet that feels unnatural in a city. I'd just turned a corner when I heard it. The whistling, that same melodic tune, the one I had convinced myself was just the wind back on the farm. I stopped dead in my tracks, my pulse hammering in my ears. It was faint, almost playful, coming from somewhere up ahead. Slowly, I turned my head. The streetlights flickered, casting long, jittery shadows. For a moment, I saw nothing, just empty sidewalks and parked cars. Then, it stepped into the light. It was the same as before, tall, gangly, its skin stretched taut over bones that seemed to shift and crack as it moved. Its eyes locked on mine, black and endless, and it smiled that impossible smile. But now, it was wearing something. A tattered flannel shirt and overalls, smeared with mud and blood, as if mocking the life I'd tried to leave behind. It tilted its head, studying me like a predator sizing up its prey. And then, it began to move. Not running, not lunging, but walking, slow and deliberate, each step a taunt. I did the only thing I could. I ran. The streets blurred as I sprinted, my lungs burning with each gasp of icy air. The whistling followed, growing louder, closer, no matter how fast I ran. I turned corner after corner, desperately searching for someone, anyone. But the city seemed empty, like the world had folded in on itself, leaving me alone with that thing. Finally, I spotted an old church, its heavy oak doors slightly ajar. I dove inside, slamming the door shut and sliding the iron bolt into place. The silence was deafening. For a moment, I thought I'd escaped. Then the whistling started again, just outside the door. It circled the building, the sound rising and falling as it moved, always just out of sight. I backed away, clutching a heavy candlestick I'd grabbed from the altar. My eyes darted to the stained glass windows, searching for any sign of movement. That's when I noticed the shadow. It stretched across the floor, long and spindly, growing larger as it moved closer to the window. Slowly, its face came into view, distorted by the colored glass, but unmistakable. It pressed a hand, if you could call it that, against the window, the claws clicking softly against the pane. And then, it smiled. I don't know what happened next. Maybe I screamed. Maybe I passed out. All I know is that when I woke up, the church was empty, the doors still bolted, and the whistling was gone. But it left something behind. On the floor, in the faint light filtering through the stained glass, was a single feather. Blood-stained and torn, just like the ones from the coop on the farm. I moved again after that, farther this time. Different city, different state. But no matter where I go, I hear it sometimes. Late at night, when the world is quiet and the shadows grow long, that faint, mocking tune, carried on a wind that doesn't belong. I don't know what it wants or why it chose me, but I know this: it's still out there, somewhere, and it's still watching. So, if you're ever out in the countryside and you hear whistling, don't follow it. Don't look for the source. Just run and pray it isn't looking for you. It started with a bet. I was bored, drunk, and feeling invincible when I said I'd spend the night out at Widow's Creek Farm. For years, it had been the town's favorite spooky story, the abandoned farmhouse, where people swore they heard voices, saw shadows moving in the windows. Local legend said the owner, Mr. Eldridge, vanished one night, and no one had been able to buy or sell the property since. Something about the land made people uneasy, but I didn't believe in all that. Armed with a flashlight, a folding chair, and a thermos of coffee, I set out to prove everyone wrong. By the time I got to the farm, the moon was low and hazy, casting just enough light to turn the barn and house into black, jagged silhouettes against the night sky. I parked the truck at the edge of the property and made my way to the porch. The wood groaned beneath my weight, the sound echoing in the absolute stillness. Inside, the house smelled like wet rot. My flashlight beam swept over faded wallpaper and furniture covered in sheets. But what struck me was the silence. No crickets, no wind, just nothing. Easy, I muttered to myself, setting up my chair in the front room where I had a clear view of the kitchen and stairs. Just a night alone in an old house. The first few hours passed without incident. I tried to stream music, but the signal was dead. That's when I heard it. A faint thud upstairs. My flashlight shot toward the staircase, catching nothing but empty steps. It's just the house settling, I told myself, though my pulse was already quickening. And then, the lantern flickered to life. It was sitting on the kitchen table, a rusty oil lantern I hadn't noticed before. A weak yellow flame danced inside, casting moving shadows on the walls. I froze. There was no one here. No one could have lit it. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. The lantern flame sputtered as if in response, then settled into a steady glow. I stepped closer, my boots dragging against the warped floorboards. The lantern's glass was clean, the wick trimmed. Someone had been here recently. I turned in a circle, shining my light into every corner of the room, but saw nothing. Then I heard the footsteps. They were coming from above me, slow, deliberate steps crossing from one end of the house to the other. My flashlight darted to the ceiling as the sound moved toward the top of the staircase. "Hello?" My voice was barely above a whisper now. The footsteps stopped. The lantern, sitting on the table just a moment before, was suddenly at the foot of the stairs. Its flame flared brightly, and for a second, I thought I saw something behind it. A shadowy figure, long and thin, its head cocked to one side as if studying me. I ran. I bolted out the front door, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly in the dark. The truck was parked just a few hundred feet away, but as I ran, the air grew thick. My legs felt heavy, like wading through molasses. I glanced back over my shoulder and stopped dead. The farmhouse was ablaze with light, every window glowing fiercely. Figures stood in the glass, tall, thin shapes that didn't move, just watched as I struggled to breathe. And then the barn door slammed open. Something crawled out of the darkness. It was on all fours, moving unnaturally fast, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. I screamed and turned back toward the truck, pushing through whatever force was holding me back. I reached the door, fumbling for the handle, but the thing was right behind me now. I felt its breath, hot, wet, and rancid, on the back of my neck. Then the truck roared to life. I didn't start it. I wasn't even inside yet. The headlights blazed on, illuminating the creature as it lunged for me. It froze in the bright beams, its skin pale and stretched, its face a featureless mask. For a moment, neither of us moved, and then it shrieked, a sound so high and sharp, it felt like needles stabbing into my ears, and darted back toward the barn. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I threw myself into the truck, slammed the door, and peeled out of there, gravel spraying in my wake. In the rearview mirror, I saw the farmhouse lights flicker and die, one by one, until only the lantern remained, glowing faintly on the porch. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back in the safety of town. I told my friends I'd lost the bet, made up some story about the place being too creepy to stay the whole night. I didn't mention the lantern, the footsteps, or the thing in the barn. I should have forgotten about it. Moved on. But last night, I woke up to find a faint yellow glow in my bedroom. The lantern was on my dresser. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The lantern sat on my dresser, its faint yellow flame steady and unmoving, the same lantern I left behind at Widow's Creek. I wanted to believe it was a nightmare, that I was still out there on the farm, and all of this was a fever dream, brought on by fear and exhaustion. But when dawn broke, the light of the flame didn't dim. It stayed just as bright, a constant reminder that whatever followed me home wasn't leaving. I couldn't stay in the house. I packed what I could and drove. No destination in mind, just miles of asphalt, and endless trees. The morning air was crisp, but I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something there, the pale, stretched face of whatever came out of that barn. But I was alone, for now. I checked into a motel on the edge of a neighboring town, telling myself this was temporary, that I could figure out what to do next once I got some sleep. But when I opened the room door, my stomach dropped. The lantern was waiting for me on the bedside table. Its flame burned just as steady, casting that sickly yellow glow. I stepped back, leaving the door open, hoping some part of me was imagining it. But when I blinked, it was still there. Something inside me snapped. I grabbed the lantern and hurled it across the room, expecting it to shatter, to douse that damn flame for good. But it didn't break. It landed on the carpet with a dull thud, the flame undisturbed. And then I heard it. The footsteps. They came from above me, faint and deliberate, just like they had in the farmhouse. My heart hammered as the sound moved across the ceiling, stopping directly above where I stood. A shadow fell over the bed. It stretched impossibly tall, the head cocked at that same unnatural angle. It wasn't cast by me. It was waiting. I fled the motel. There was no plan now, just an overwhelming need to keep moving. I drove for hours, the highway blurring into a gray monotony. The lantern didn't appear in the car, and for a fleeting moment, I thought maybe I'd left it behind. Maybe it was over. Then the radio crackled to life. At first it was static, but slowly I started to hear a voice, a low, garbled whisper, almost like it was trying to speak, but couldn't quite form words. I turned the radio off, but the whispering didn't stop. It was coming from the air vents now, from the faint hum of the engine. Widow? Waiting? My grip tightened on the wheel, knuckles white as bone. The voice was clearer now, repeating those same words over and over. Widow, waiting, widow, waiting. It was nearly sunset when the truck broke down. The engine sputtered and died, leaving me stranded on a stretch of empty road. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. When I finally got out, the landscape around me was unfamiliar. Flat fields stretched out on either side of the road, broken only by the silhouette of a barn in the distance. My blood ran cold. It was Widow's Creek. The truck wouldn't start. My phone had no signal. I was trapped, and I knew I wasn't alone. The lantern was on the hood of the truck now, its light flickering weakly in the dusk. The footsteps started again. They were closer this time, moving with purpose, circling the truck. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it. A presence, heavy and oppressive, like the air itself was pressing down on me. My flashlight barely cut through the growing darkness, but I swept it in frantic arcs, trying to find the source of the sound. That's when I saw them. Figures emerging from the fields, their movements slow and jerky. They were tall and thin, their bodies stretched unnaturally, their faces blank slates of pale skin. Dozens of them all converging on the truck. I grabbed the lantern off the hood without thinking, clutching it like it might somehow protect me. The figures stopped, their heads tilting in unison toward the light. The flame flared brighter, and for a moment, they hesitated. "Leave!" I screamed, holding the lantern high. The figures shrank back, their forms dissolving into the shadows. But the moment didn't last. The flame sputtered, growing dimmer, and they began to move again. Faster this time, closing the distance with unnatural speed. I don't remember how I made it back to the farmhouse, only that I did. The lantern led me, its glow flickering through the dark, guiding me past the barn and into the house. The door slammed shut behind me, and I locked it, though I knew it wouldn't keep them out. The figures were at the windows now, their faces pressed against the glass. The lantern sat on the table where I'd first found it, its flame burning weakly. And then it spoke. "Burn it," the voice whispered, faint and hollow. "End it." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the lantern and smashed it against the floor. The oil spilled out, catching fire immediately. The flames spread fast, consuming the room, the walls, everything. The figures at the windows screamed, their cries high and inhuman, and then they were gone. I ran. The farmhouse burned behind me, a towering inferno that lit up the night. By the time I reached the edge of the property, the house had collapsed in on itself, the flames dying down to embers. I don't know what I unleashed that night, or if I stopped it. The lantern was gone, but its light still haunts me. Sometimes when the nights are quiet and the air is still, I catch a faint yellow glow out of the corner of my eye, and I wonder if it's waiting for me to come back. The night started like any other, quiet, uneventful, with a slight chill in the air as the moon hung high over the sprawling farmland. I'd agreed to watch over my friend's farm while he and his wife took a rare weekend off. The place was massive, bordered by dense woods on one side and endless cornfields on the other. I was promised nothing more than a cozy guest room and some peace. Instead, I got something I'll never forget. By midnight, the house was silent. The livestock, a handful of cows and a stubborn old mule, were already settled in the barn. I'd finished my last round through the property, locked the doors, and double-checked the generator, since the area was notorious for power outages. All seemed fine. I was halfway into a second beer, flipping channels on an old TV in the living room, when I heard it. A sharp metallic asterisk, clank asterisk, like something striking the barn door. My first thought was, raccoons. They're bold out here. I grabbed a flashlight and headed outside. The yard stretched out into shadows, the barn standing 100 yards from the house, just beyond the motion-activated light's reach. As I stepped closer, the light snapped on. My stomach dropped. The barn door was wide open, swaying slightly in the breeze. Raccoons don't do that, I muttered to myself. The beam from my flashlight cut through the dark as I stepped inside. The barn smelled of hay and earth, familiar but strangely oppressive that night. The cows were agitated, shifting nervously in their pens, their eyes reflecting the light with unnatural brightness. The mule, usually indifferent to everything, let out a low, uneasy bray from the back corner. "Hello?" I called out, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe I hoped whoever, or whatever, was there would just leave if they heard me. No response. Just the sound of animals shifting and the faint creak of the barn's wooden beams. Then I saw them. Footprints in the dirt floor. Bare, human-like prints. But they were wrong. The toes were too long, almost clawed, and the stride was unnatural, too far apart, like whoever made them was crawling or bounding rather than walking. I followed the tracks to the far corner of the barn, where the mule stood trembling, its ears pinned back. Beyond it was the old ladder that led up to the hayloft. The prints stopped there, but the mule's reaction told me whatever it was hadn't just disappeared. I didn't want to go up there. Every instinct screamed to leave, to lock the barn, and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But I couldn't shake the feeling that if I ignored it, whatever was lurking up there wouldn't stay contained. I climbed the ladder slowly, the wooden rungs creaking under my weight. My flashlight swept across the hayloft. It was empty at first glance, just piles of straw and old tools gathering dust. Then I noticed something odd. In the far corner, where the moonlight filtered through the slats, the hay was matted down, like something had been lying there, and next to it, scratch marks, long, deep grooves in the wood, as if made by claws. That's when I heard it, a faint clicking sound coming from above me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The barn had no second story, just the roof beams overhead. Slowly, I tilted the flashlight upward. Something was there, crouched among the beams, its pale limbs impossibly thin and long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle, as if studying me. Its eyes reflected the light like an animal's, but they were too big, too human. It moved suddenly, skittering along the beams like a spider, the clicking sound growing louder as its claws scraped against the wood. I don't remember climbing down. 1 second, I was staring at it, and the next, I was sprinting toward the house, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, my heart pounding so hard, it hurt. The house felt wrong now, like it wasn't safe anymore. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Not unusual for the area, but it felt deliberate. Then, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. I could hear it now. The faint asterisk, click, click, click asterisk of claws on the porch outside. It wasn't trying to hide anymore. It wanted me to know it was there. I moved as quietly as I could, grabbing the only weapon I could find, a rusty hatchet from the fireplace tools. The sound moved to the side of the house, then the back, as if it was circling, testing the walls. Then came the worst sound yet, the creak of a window sliding open upstairs. It was in the house. My mind raced. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide that it wouldn't find me. The only option was to face it. Hatchet in hand, I crept up the stairs, every step feeling like it could be my last. The hallway stretched out in front of me, the guest room door slightly ajar. The faint moonlight spilling in showed the curtains fluttering. The window was wide open. The clicking had stopped. I pushed the door open slowly. The room was empty, but the bedspread was disturbed. Claw marks raked across the headboard. My pulse was deafening in my ears as I backed out of the room. That's when I felt it. Hot breath against my neck. I spun around, swinging the hatchet wildly. It caught something, the blade sinking in with a wet asterisk thunk asterisk. A screech filled the air, high-pitched and inhuman. The creature recoiled, its long limbs thrashing as it tried to pull away. I saw it clearly for the first time, its skin pale and stretched taut over its bones, its face a grotesque mimicry of human features, twisted into something predatory. I didn't stop swinging until it stopped moving. When the sun rose, I buried what was left of it in the woods. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. My friend's farm looks peaceful in the daylight, but I'll never stay there again. Some things aren't meant to be explained, and some places aren't meant to be guarded, alone. A week after that night, I got a call from my friend. He thanked me for watching the farm and casually asked if I noticed anything strange while I was there. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. How could I explain what happened without sounding insane? Instead of answering directly, I asked why he'd asked. His tone shifted, less casual, more guarded. Well, he began. We've been having issues for a while. Strange sounds in the barn, missing animals. Thought maybe it was coyotes or feral dogs. But the footprints we've found don't match anything we know. The neighbors have seen things near the woods. Things? I asked, my voice tight. Yeah, like figures. Too tall, too thin, running on all fours. One of the neighbors swears it looked right at him. They won't come near the property now. He laughed nervously. Honestly, I figured it was just their imagination, until we started losing livestock. I gripped the phone tighter, my pulse quickening. Why didn't you tell me this before I stayed there?" There was a long pause. "I didn't want to scare you off. Besides, we figured it was just animals. Nothing that'd bother a person, you know?" I didn't respond. My thoughts were spiraling back to that night, to the thing in the barn, its impossible limbs, the way it moved, how it felt too smart, too aware. "Hey," he added, "we're putting the place up for sale. The wife and I decided it's not worth the stress. Whoever buys it can deal with whatever's out there." That was the last time I heard from him. The farm sold within a month, and I heard the new owners moved in without issue. For a while, I thought that was the end of it. I tried to convince myself that whatever I'd faced that night was gone, that maybe I'd killed it. But deep down, I knew better. About 3 months later, I was back in the city, starting to feel normal again. Then one evening, as I was locking up my apartment for the night, I heard it. A faint asterisk, click, 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 asterisk, from somewhere in the hallway. My blood ran cold. I stood frozen, staring at the peephole in my door, expecting to see something staring back. But when I finally worked up the courage to look, the hallway was empty. The sound stopped. But now, every night when it's quiet, I listen for it. Sometimes I think I hear it, just at the edge of perception. A soft, rhythmic asterisk, click, 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 asterisk, like claws on wood, like it's waiting for me. And I know one thing for sure: whatever it is, it doesn't stay on the farm. I've never told anyone this before, mostly because I know no one would believe me, and honestly, I don't know if I believe it myself. But I've been haunted by it ever since. Maybe if I write it down, I can let it go. This happened a few years ago. I was doing a solo road trip through the Midwest. I'd planned it as a way to clear my head after a messy breakup. I was hitting every weird roadside attraction I could find. Giant fiberglass animals, tiny museums, old diners. You know, Americana at its quirkiest. It was the middle of nowhere, somewhere on a back road in South Dakota, when my car started making that sound. You know the one. The grinding that makes your stomach drop because you know it's bad. The "I'm about to be stranded" sound. I pulled over to the side of the road. Nothing but flat fields in every direction. Not a single car had passed me in hours. Cell service? Forget it. I popped the hood, but I didn't know what I was looking at. Just a steaming, hissing mess. And then, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, I saw it. A beat-up old RV trundling toward me, rattling like it was held together with duct tape and prayer. I waved it down, figuring whoever was inside might have a phone or at least a toolbox. The RV stopped a few feet ahead of my car. The door creaked open, and a man stepped out. He was tall, with stringy hair and a faded denim jacket. His face was pale and gaunt, like he hadn't slept in weeks. "You need some help?" he asked, his voice gravelly. I nodded, trying not to let the growing unease show on my face. "Car broke down. Got any tools?" He tilted his head, like he was considering. Then he smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile you'd see on a crocodile before it snapped its jaws shut. "I got tools," he said. "Why don't you come inside? Safer than waiting out here in the dark." There was something off about him, but I figured I didn't have much of a choice. I followed him up the rickety steps into the RV. The first thing that hit me was the smell, like meat left out in the sun too long. Inside, it was cluttered. Piles of dirty clothes, tools scattered everywhere, and jars. Lots of jars, all lined up on shelves. Each one was filled with a murky liquid, and floating inside were things. I couldn't tell what they were, but some looked like animal parts. Others, Not so much. He rummaged through a drawer, pulling out wrenches and pliers. "What brings you out here?" he asked over his shoulder. "Just a road trip," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He chuckled. "Not many folks come down this road, not unless they're lost or looking for something." The way he said it made my skin crawl. I decided I'd grab whatever tools he handed me and get out of there as fast as possible. But before I could say anything, he turned to me, holding a massive wrench. "You ever seen something you can't explain?" he asked, his eyes boring into mine. "What do you mean?" I asked, backing toward the door. "You know," he said, gesturing to the jars. "Things that don't belong in this world." I glanced at the jars again. One of them had what looked like a human hand inside, only it had too many fingers, and the skin was an unnatural, waxy yellow. "I think I should get back to my car," I said, trying to sound casual. But he blocked the door. "What's the rush? Night's coming, and out here when it gets dark, that's when they come out." "Who?" I asked, my heart pounding. He grinned again, wider this time. "The ones that aren't supposed to be here. The ones that used to be human." I pushed past him and stumbled out of the RV, dropping the wrench in the process. I ran back to my car, not daring to look behind me. The engine was still dead, but I didn't care. I locked the doors and sat there, my hands shaking on the wheel. That's when I saw it. Something was moving in the fields. At first, I thought it was a deer, or maybe a coyote, but then I realized it was standing upright. Tall, too tall, with long, gangly arms that hung almost to the ground. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes glowed faintly in the dark. I wasn't alone. There were more of them, emerging from the tall grass, moving toward the RV, toward me. The man stepped out of the RV, holding something in his hands, a jar, glowing faintly with that same sickly light as their eyes. He held it up, and the creatures stopped. They tilted their heads, watching him, like they were waiting for something. I don't know what happened next. I closed my eyes, praying they wouldn't notice me. When I opened them, the man and the creatures were gone. The RV was still there, its door swinging in the breeze. But the man, the things, gone. I spent the night in my car, too scared to move. By morning, the RV was gone too. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't want to know. All I know is, if you're ever driving through South Dakota and your car breaks down, don't accept help from anyone. And if you see something moving in the fields after dark, don't look too closely. I didn't stick around to find out what else might be lurking. As soon as the sun crested the horizon, I jumped out of the car and started walking, following the road in the direction I'd come from. The air felt heavy, like the earth itself wanted to hold me in place, but I forced myself to keep moving. Every few minutes, I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see that RV rumbling after me, or those things slinking through the fields. I must have walked for hours before I saw it. A gas station. It looked ancient, with peeling paint and a sign that barely hung onto its rusted frame. But it was a lifeline. I broke into a jog, relief flooding my chest. The old man behind the counter didn't even look up when I came in, out of breath and wild-eyed. His face was weathered, his skin a deep tan from years under the sun, and he wore a trucker cap pulled low over his forehead. "Morning," he said, chewing on a toothpick. His tone was calm, disinterested, like he saw people like me every day. "My car broke down," I blurted out. "Can I use your phone?" The man squinted at me, then slowly reached under the counter, pulling out an ancient rotary phone. "No cell service out here. Use this." I dialed a tow truck company, stammering out my location as best I could. They told me it'd take a couple of hours to get someone out there. Fine. I could wait. As I hung up, the old man was watching me. His gaze was sharp now, the kind of look that felt like it could peel away your skin to see what was underneath. "You come down from the East Road?" he asked, voice low. I nodded. "See anything strange?" I hesitated, not sure how to answer. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward, elbows on the counter. "I mean, did you see them?" I froze. My stomach turned to ice. The man sighed and shook his head. "You're lucky you made it here. Most folks don't. Not when they're out after dark." "What are they?" I whispered. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood, walked over to the window, and peered out at the empty road. A long time ago, this place wasn't just farmland. There was something here, something bad. The old folks called it the Hollow. Said it was a place where the world didn't sit right, where the line between this world and other things was thin. He turned back to me, his face grim. People built over it, figured they could just bury it and move on. But you can't bury something like that. It stays. It waits. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "The man in the RV, does he have something to do with it?" The old man's eyes darkened. "If you saw him, you're lucky you got away. He's not a man, not anymore." I wanted to ask more, but the distant rumble of an engine cut me off. The tow truck pulled into the lot, kicking up a cloud of dust. I thanked the old man and hurried out, eager to put as much distance as I could between myself and whatever had happened out there. The tow truck driver was chatty at first, but when I told him where my car had broken down, he went quiet. He didn't say another word for the rest of the ride. We got back to the nearest town, and I left my car at a local mechanic. I thought about telling someone, maybe the cops, but what would I even say? That I'd seen monsters in a field, that a man with jars full of nightmares had invited me into his RV. No one would believe me. I bought a bus ticket back home and didn't look back. But sometimes, when I'm driving at night, I see something out of the corner of my eye. A flicker of movement in the fields, a shadow where there shouldn't be one. And every time, my chest tightens, and I grip the wheel a little harder. I don't take back roads anymore. I don't stop for strangers. And I never, ever look too closely at what might be watching from the dark. Because I know, deep down, that the Hollow is still out there, and some roads should never be traveled. The tires hummed against the asphalt as I drove down the endless stretch of highway, a black ribbon cutting through the vast desert. I was on the third day of my road trip, a solo journey I planned to clear my head and escape the monotony of my 9-to-5. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a cathartic drive through America's forgotten backroads, listening to music and collecting memories. But everything changed that night. I had just passed a rusted green sign reading Sandorian, 30 miles, when I noticed the gas gauge hovering dangerously close to empty. The needle was almost kissing the E, and my GPS, though barely functional in the desert, showed no gas stations nearby. I cursed under my breath and leaned forward, squinting into the darkness. A faint glow appeared on the horizon, a sign of civilization. It wasn't a gas station. The glow belonged to an old diner, sitting at the edge of nowhere. Its neon sign flickered, spelling "Dine and Shine" in a dull orange light. Relief flooded through me. At least it was a place to stop, ask for directions, and maybe buy a cup of coffee while I planned my next move. I pulled into the gravel lot, my headlights sweeping across a couple of dusty trucks and an old station wagon. The diner looked as tired as the vehicles parked outside. A bell jingled above the door as I entered, and I was hit with the smell of stale grease and coffee, so burnt it seemed aggressive. The diner was empty except for the waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, and a single customer sitting at the far corner booth. The man didn't look up as I walked in, his face obscured by a hood. I sat at the counter, ordered a coffee, and explained my gas situation to the waitress. She nodded, lips pressed tight, and pointed to an old payphone by the restrooms. "You can call Manny," she said. "He's got a gas can and lives nearby. Charges a bit extra for the trouble, though." I thanked her, but before I could move, the hooded man turned his head slightly in my direction. His eyes glinted like wet asphalt in the dim light. I froze. "Don't bother," he said softly. His voice was low and gravelly. "You won't make it to Sandorian tonight." I chuckled nervously, trying to shake off the chill that ran down my spine. "Why's that?" I asked. The man leaned back, the shadows swallowing his face again. "You just won't?" The waitress shot him a sharp look, muttered something under her breath, and walked to the back kitchen, leaving me alone in the awkward silence. I glanced at the man's booth. Empty plates were stacked neatly in front of him, but his hands were out of sight beneath the table. He was perfectly still, the kind of stillness that felt unnatural. I decided to take my chances and called Manny. The line rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. "Dine and Shine Diner? I'll be there in 20. Don't go anywhere." When I returned to my seat, the hooded man was gone. The door hadn't jingled. I turned to the waitress, who had just come back from the kitchen. "Where'd the guy go?" She frowned. "What guy?" I stared at her, my skin prickling. "The guy in the corner booth. Hooded sweatshirt, he..." She cut me off. "We don't get many visitors here this time of night. You're the only one who's come in." I glanced at the corner booth again. The plates were gone. The air felt heavier now, pressing against my chest. I decided to wait outside for Manny. The desert was eerily quiet. No wind, no distant hum of wildlife, just the sound of my own breathing and the faint buzz of the flickering neon sign. The stars were brilliant overhead, but even their beauty couldn't shake the growing unease gnawing at me. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint at first, crunching on the gravel behind the diner. I turned quickly, expecting to see Manny, or maybe the hooded man. There was no one. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled the building slowly, deliberately. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The footsteps paused. Then they started again, faster this time. They were coming toward me. I backed up against my car, heart pounding, fumbling for my keys. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were just around the corner of the diner. I jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door and locking it in one swift motion. A shadow moved at the edge of my headlights. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. The shape was wrong, distorted, like something from a fever dream. It didn't move like a person, more like a marionette with broken strings. And then it stopped, standing just at the edge of the light, as if it knew the glow was a barrier it couldn't cross. I didn't wait to find out. I turned the ignition. The engine sputtered. The shadow moved closer. I twisted the key again, praying, pleading. The car roared to life, and I peeled out of the lot, gravel spraying behind me. My heart was racing as I sped down the empty highway, the diner's neon sign shrinking in my rearview mirror. But as I drove, something gnawed at me. The man's words in the diner. "You won't make it to Sandorian tonight." The thought struck me like a hammer. He hadn't said I couldn't. He said I wouldn't. I glanced at the rearview mirror again. That's when I saw it. The shadow wasn't at the diner anymore. It was in my back seat. I slammed on the brakes so hard, the tires screeched, sending the car skidding to a halt in the middle of the desolate highway. My breathing was erratic, my chest heaving like I'd just sprinted a mile. The rearview mirror quivered as the car settled, but the shadow in the back seat didn't move. I couldn't bring myself to turn around. My eyes locked on the mirror, sweat dripping down my temple. The shadow was just there. A formless dark mass that seemed to pulse and shift like smoke caught in a vacuum. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice cracking. No answer, no movement, just silence. Gathering every ounce of courage I didn't think I had, I slowly turned my head. The back seat was empty. Relief rushed over me so violently that I almost laughed. Almost. I straightened in my seat, rubbed my temples, and tried to shake off the terror as the absurdity of it all settled in. Sleep deprivation, I thought, my mind playing tricks on me. I put the car back into gear and continued driving. The headlights pierced the darkness, revealing nothing but endless road and desert, stretching into oblivion. Yet, no matter how much I rationalized, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every now and then, I glanced at the mirror, half expecting to see that shadowy thing again. But it was just me, and the yawning void of the highway behind me. Then the radio crackled. The static came out of nowhere, cutting through the silence like a razor. I hadn't even realized the radio was on, and when I reached to turn it off, a voice emerged. It was faint, distorted, but unmistakably human. "Turn around." My blood froze. I ripped the knob off the radio, but the voice didn't stop. It grew louder, the static more aggressive. "Turn around." The dashboard lights flickered, and the car shuddered, as if something massive had latched onto it. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles white, as I pushed the accelerator to the floor. The engine roared, and I sped down the highway, adrenaline coursing through me. And then the headlights died. Darkness swallowed the car whole. I couldn't see the road, the desert, or even my own hands gripping the steering wheel. The world dissolved into pitch black, and the only sound was the frantic thrum of my heart. "Turn around," the voice whispered again, so close it felt like it was coming from the passenger seat. I couldn't help myself. I turned. What I saw wasn't human. A pair of eyes gleamed in the darkness, glowing a sickly yellow, like lanterns in a fog. They didn't blink. They didn't look away. They were fixed on me with an intensity that felt like it could peel back my skin and see everything beneath. Its face was wrong, shifting and changing, like trying to hold water in your hands. At one moment, it had a gaping, toothy grin. The next, its mouth was stretched impossibly wide, as if it could swallow the car whole. And those eyes, they never moved, never faltered. They burned into me, drilling into my mind, paralyzing me. "Why are you running?" it asked, its voice overlapping with itself, both a whisper and a roar. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My body was locked, frozen in terror. The creature's hand, or what passed for a hand, reached out. Long skeletal fingers stretched toward me, their tips curling like talons. I thought this was it, that I was done for, that I would die here on this God-forsaken highway, my body never found. But then, the car jerked violently. The headlights flickered back on, illuminating the road ahead. I realized I was barreling straight toward a sharp turn. I yanked the wheel, narrowly avoiding plummeting into a rocky ravine. The tires screeched, the car swerved, and I came to a stop, my chest heaving, tears streaming down my face. When I looked back to the passenger seat, it was empty. The voice was gone. The static was gone. The road was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. The shadow, the eyes, the voice, they were real. I knew it. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, my entire body trembling with fear. I couldn't stay on that highway. I had to get to Sandorian no matter what. I pressed the gas, driving as fast as the car could go without flying off the road. The desert began to change. The air grew colder, the stars above dimmer. The world felt heavier, as if the very fabric of reality was shifting. Then I saw it, a sign up ahead. Sandorian, 5 miles. Relief surged through me. I was close. I could make it. But as I passed the sign, something moved in the corner of my eye. I glanced at the rearview mirror. The shadow was back. It wasn't just in the back seat this time. It filled the car, seeping into every corner like an inky mist. The voice returned, louder and more insistent. "You shouldn't have come here." The car began to spin. I tried to control it, but the wheel was unresponsive. The shadow swirled around me, thick and suffocating. My vision blurred, and the world dissolved into a maelstrom of darkness and sound. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, I was parked at the entrance to Sandorian. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the small abandoned town. My hands were still gripping the wheel, my knuckles white. The shadow was gone. I stepped out of the car, the morning air crisp and quiet. But as I stood there, staring at the empty streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped, that whatever followed me was still watching, waiting. The road trip was over, but the terror wasn't. I hate long drives at night. There's something about the dark highway stretching endlessly ahead, broken only by the faint glow of my headlights, that gets under my skin. But this trip couldn't wait. My boss had been clear. Either deliver the package to the facility upstate by morning, or don't bother coming in on Monday. So there I was, cruising down an empty interstate at 2 a.m., miles from anywhere. The radio spitting static because even the FM signals seemed too afraid to linger here. My GPS kept glitching, and my phone battery was draining unnaturally fast, despite being plugged in. Not great. It started with a shadow. I first saw it in my rearview mirror, a flicker just beyond the reach of my taillights. At 60 miles per hour, it shouldn't have been possible for anything to move that fast. Yet, there it was. Something humanoid, with limbs too long and angular to belong to a person, darting across the lane behind me. I brushed it off. Sleep deprivation, I told myself. A trick of the light. But then it darted closer, sticking to the shoulder, like it was stalking me. It didn't feel like a hallucination anymore. Still, I kept driving. Slowing down wasn't an option, and there was no way I was pulling over to investigate. Not here. Not in the middle of nowhere. The radio clicked off suddenly. Silence. And that's when the thing hit my car. The impact slammed me forward, and my tires screeched as I veered into the opposite lane, narrowly missing a guardrail. My heart pounded in my chest as I fought to control the wheel. What the hell was that? When I stopped the car and stepped out, it was so quiet I could hear my own blood rushing in my ears. The back of my car had a huge dent, like something heavy had crashed into it. But there was no debris, no animal carcass, nothing. I scanned the area, my phone's flashlight trembling in my hand. "Hello?" I called, instantly regretting it. My voice sounded too loud, too fragile, against the oppressive quiet. Something answered. The response came as a whisper. No, not a whisper, a movement. From the edge of the flashlight's beam, something crawled into view. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its body was gaunt and pale, stretched thin over jagged bones, with skin that gleamed unnaturally under the light. It moved low to the ground, its spindly limbs clicking like branches in a storm. Its face, or what I assumed was its face, was featureless, except for a faint suggestion of eyes, black and sunken deep into the skull. I froze. The creature tilted its head, as if studying me. Then it opened its mouth, or rather, it split. A gash ran down the center of its head, peeling back to reveal rows of teeth, jagged and glistening. It let out a sound like metal scraping against stone. I bolted back to my car. As I slammed the door shut, the thing lunged. Its body smacked against my windshield, its claws raking the glass. I floored the gas pedal, tires screeching as I sped off, the creature clinging to the hood. It began pounding on the windshield, spiderweb cracks forming under its blows. My heart raced as I swerved, trying to throw it off. But the thing held firm, its mouth gaping wider, that awful screeching sound cutting through the roar of the engine. I saw a turn up ahead, a sharp bend that veered into a dirt road. I didn't think. I cranked the wheel hard and braced myself as the car skidded. The creature lost its grip, flung violently into the ditch, but my relief was short-lived. In the rearview mirror, I saw it rise. Slowly, its limbs cracked and twisted unnaturally as it stood taller now, towering over the roadside brush, and it was running after me. My foot pressed the accelerator to the floor, but the dirt road slowed me down. The car bounced and jolted over the uneven terrain, the headlights illuminating the narrow path ahead. I could hear it, behind me, gaining. Then up ahead, I saw it. A tunnel. An old, decrepit bridge I hadn't seen on the GPS earlier. I didn't care. It was my only option. The tunnel swallowed me in darkness as I barreled through. My headlights flickered and sputtered, but I kept going, heart pounding. The creature's footsteps faded behind me. For a moment, I thought I was safe. Then the lights on my dashboard went out. The engine sputtered. The car rolled to a stop. "No," I whispered, frantically turning the key in the ignition. Nothing. I reached for my phone, but it was dead too. The battery inexplicably drained. The silence in the tunnel was suffocating. And then, a sound. A wet, slithering noise, echoing off the tunnel walls. It was here. I grabbed the flashlight from the glove box, hands shaking, and stepped out of the car. The air felt heavy, oppressive. My breath came out in shallow gasps as I swept the beam around. The creature stood at the far end of the tunnel, only it wasn't alone anymore. Figures emerged from the shadows, their gaunt, pale forms crawling on all fours, their eyeless faces turned toward me in unison. "Stay back!" I shouted, though my voice cracked with fear. They didn't. The first one moved toward me, slow at first, then faster, its claws clicking against the concrete. I swung the flashlight wildly, but the beam did nothing to slow it down. I ran. My legs burned as I sprinted down the tunnel, the creatures chasing me, their guttural screeches bouncing off the walls. I could see the faint glow of moonlight ahead, the tunnel's exit looming closer, but so were they. One of them lunged, claws raking my shoulder. I stumbled, but adrenaline kept me moving. I burst out of the tunnel into the open air, and then, silence. I turned back, expecting to see them still chasing me, but the tunnel was empty. I stood there panting, my shoulder bleeding, heart hammering in my chest. They were gone, or at least, they wouldn't leave the tunnel. I didn't wait to find out why. I staggered to the highway, flagged down a trucker, and left my car, and that place, behind. But the tunnel didn't leave me. When I close my eyes at night, I hear the clicking, the scraping. I see those empty faces, waiting, watching. And sometimes when the room is quiet enough, I think I hear them whispering my name. The road stretched out endlessly, swallowed by a dense fog that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. The motel sign, flickering dimly, read, "Rest Haven Inn, vacancy." It was a beacon in the darkness, though not the kind you'd want to follow. I didn't have much of a choice. My car's engine sputtered to a halt miles back, and my phone had barely a sliver of battery left. The rain was relentless, hammering down on the hood as if trying to drown the world itself. I stepped out, drenched in seconds, and made my way toward the peeling sign. The motel was one of those places you'd drive past without a second glance. Paint chipped off the walls, the once pristine white now a sickly yellow. A neon open sign buzzed faintly in the window of the office, the light barely illuminating the single desk inside. As I entered, a bell above the door let out a harsh jingle. The man behind the counter was gaunt, his sunken eyes fixed on a small, old-fashioned TV playing static. He didn't look up until I cleared my throat. "Room?" he croaked, his voice a rasp that set my nerves on edge. "Yeah," I replied, trying to sound braver than I felt. "For the night." He slid a key across the counter, its brass surface tarnished. "Room 7. Don't mind the noise." Noise? I didn't ask. I should have. The hallway to room 7 smelled faintly of mildew, and the carpet squished under my boots. The flickering light bulbs above cast strange, shifting shadows along the corridor. I turned the key in the lock, pushing the door open to reveal a cramped room with outdated furniture. A single lamp illuminated the space, its glow barely fighting back the encroaching darkness. I dropped my bag on the bed and exhaled. The rain beat against the window like 1,000 desperate hands. It wasn't ideal, but it would do. That was when I heard it. A faint scratching noise, coming from inside the closet. I froze, the weight of the room pressing down on me. The sound was faint, rhythmic, like nails dragging against wood. My rational side kicked in, whispering that it was just the rain or the old building settling. But something deeper, primal, told me otherwise. I took a hesitant step toward the closet. The floor creaked beneath my weight, and the noise stopped. Dead silence. Even the rain seemed to hush, as if the world was holding its breath. My hand trembled as I reached for the closet door handle. With a sharp yank, I flung the door open. Empty. Just a few rusted hangers swaying gently on the rod, their movement likely stirred by the draft. I let out a shaky laugh, scolding myself for being so jumpy. But as I turned back to the bed, I noticed something. The closet wasn't empty anymore. The hangers were still. But a dark shape had appeared in the back corner. A mass, tall, hunched and silent, almost blending into the shadows. My heart slammed against my ribs as I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the bed. The thing didn't move. It was there, but wrong. The darkness seemed to warp around it, like it was swallowing light. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Nothing. And then it lurched forward. I bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock as my fingers refused to cooperate. Behind me, the thing shuffled closer, its breathing wet and raspy, like air being sucked through broken glass. I threw the door open and sprinted into the hallway, not daring to look back. The corridor stretched endlessly before me, far longer than it had been when I arrived. Every door I passed was closed, each one rattling violently as I ran. The flickering lights above dimmed, casting the hall in an eerie twilight. My lungs burned, my feet barely touching the ground as I reached the motel office. The gaunt man was gone. The static on the old TV had turned into faint whispers, an indistinct cacophony of voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I slammed my fists on the counter, shouting for help, but no one came. The whispers grew louder, and I felt the presence behind me again. Turning slowly, I saw it standing at the entrance. Only now, it was clearer. The figure was impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and contorted. Its face, or what should have been a face, was smooth and featureless, save for a slit that opened and closed, emitting that sickening, raspy breath. It stepped forward, and the motel seemed to shudder around us. Walls cracked, and the air grew dense, like trying to breathe underwater. I stumbled backward, grabbing at anything I could use as a weapon, my hand closing around an old desk lamp. Without thinking, I hurled it at the thing. The lamp shattered on impact, and for a brief moment the figure recoiled, its form flickering like a broken projection. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran. The rain hit me like a wall as I burst outside, the neon sign flickering violently above the door. My car, dead just hours ago, sat in the lot, its headlights glowing faintly. I didn't question it. I jumped in, turned the key, and, miraculously, the engine roared to life. As I sped down the empty road, the motel disappeared into the fog behind me. But even as I put miles between us, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The rain on the windshield looked darker, thicker, almost like tar. The whispers from the office were still faintly audible, growing louder as I drove. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figure sitting in the back seat. There's something about motels that never feels right. Maybe it's the lingering scent of bleach failing to cover something worse, or the flicker of a neon sign casting shadows where there shouldn't be any. That night, I pulled into a motel on a desolate stretch of highway, half dead from exhaustion and fully creeped out by the empty lobby. No one stood at the reception desk, just a small bell and a paper with the word "ring" written in shaky, faded letters. I hit the bell once. The ding echoed like I'd stepped into a void. Seconds dragged, then a door creaked open behind the counter. A man shuffled out, a clerk, I assumed. His uniform was stained, his posture stooped like something heavy was pressing on his shoulders. His face was pale, the kind of pale that doesn't come from lack of sun, but something deeper, almost wrong. He handed me a key without a word and pointed down the dimly lit hallway. Room 107. I hesitated. Something about the key gave me pause. It was old, heavy brass, engraved with symbols too worn to read. "Everything okay?" I asked. The man didn't answer. He just turned, disappearing back through the door. I considered getting back in my car and driving until I hit civilization, but the fatigue anchored me. My brain whispered, "Just one night." The hallway stretched unnervingly long as I made my way to 107. The doors I passed seemed older than the building itself, their paint chipped and wood warped. The carpet squished under my feet like it had soaked up years of spills and secrets. When I reached my door, I noticed something odd. The door to room 106 was ajar. Dark inside, but I could see something swinging gently from the ceiling, brushing the edge of the frame. A chain? No, it looked like hair. I almost knocked, almost let my curiosity get the better of me. Instead, I hurried into 107, bolted the door, and let the heavy silence of the room settle around me. The bedspread was an unholy pattern of orange and green, torn in places. The air smelled faintly of damp earth. As I dropped my bag onto the bed, the first noise came, a low, rhythmic tapping from the adjoining wall. I froze. The tapping against the adjoining wall was faint at first, like fingers drumming on wood. My initial instinct was to rationalize it. Pipes, maybe. Or someone next door shifting in their bed. But it didn't stop. It grew louder, more deliberate, as though it was waiting for a response. I cleared my throat, trying to steady my nerves. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The tapping stopped. For a moment, the room was so silent, I could hear the faint buzz of the flickering overhead light. Then there was a noise, a low, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the carpet. It wasn't coming from the wall this time. It was coming from inside my room. My stomach dropped. The air grew cold enough for my breath to cloud in front of me. Slowly, I turned toward the closet. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling into the room. I stared, my pulse hammering in my ears. The dragging sound stopped. I reached for the lamp on the nightstand, gripping its cold base like a makeshift weapon. For a long moment, I just stood there, breathing hard, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then, from behind the closet door, I heard it. A whisper. It wasn't clear words, more like a breathy murmur. But it was there, distinctly human. My fingers tightened around the lamp, and I forced myself to move. My knees shook as I took a step forward, then another. I stretched out a trembling hand and gripped the closet door. With a yank, I threw it open. Nothing. Just empty space, an old coat hanger, and a sour smell. I exhaled a shaky laugh, my body still tense with adrenaline. "Get it together," I muttered to myself, shutting the door with a sharp click. That's when I noticed the mirror. It was hanging on the opposite wall, just above the small dresser, and in its reflection, I saw the closet door swinging open again, slowly, silently. But it wasn't empty this time. A figure stood there, too tall to fit in the closet naturally, its head hunched at an unnatural angle to avoid brushing the ceiling. Its limbs were impossibly long, its skin a grayish tone. The face, if you could call it that, was featureless, except for a mouth stretched into a gaping, soundless scream. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The thing stepped out of the closet, moving with a jerky, almost puppet-like motion. Into the mirror, I could see it approaching, its elongated arms stretching toward me. My fight or flight kicked in. I dropped the lamp and bolted for the door. The air grew heavier with every step, as though something was pulling me back. My vision blurred, and my ears were filled with a deafening, static-like hum. I wrenched the door open and stumbled into the hallway, slamming it behind me. I ran. The hallway seemed endless, the dim lighting flickering erratically. My chest burned, and my legs felt like lead, but I didn't stop. When I reached the lobby, it was empty again. The clerk was nowhere in sight. I burst through the front doors into the night, gasping for air. The neon sign above the motel flickered ominously as I fumbled for my car keys. When I glanced back at the building, I saw it. Room 107's window, glowing faintly. The curtain moved as if something or someone was watching me leave. I didn't stick around to find out. I drove for hours, not caring where I was going, just needing to put distance between me and that place. Eventually, I pulled into a gas station and sat there, gripping the wheel, trying to steady my breathing. The clerk inside gave me a strange look when I stumbled in for water. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, though I didn't feel it. As I paid, I noticed the TV behind the counter was playing the news. My stomach twisted as the headlines scrolled across the screen. Missing persons reports filed for guests of the Highway Motel. Authorities investigating multiple disappearances. The screen flashed photos of the missing. One of them looked eerily familiar, a face I'd seen in the mirror. I didn't stay to watch the rest. I just got in my car and drove, hoping to outrun the image burned into my memory. But deep down, I knew the truth. I'd been marked that night, and no matter how far I drove, how fast, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following me. The motel's vacancy sign buzzed dimly against the pitch-black highway, each flicker of the neon a whisper, luring me off the endless asphalt. It was nearly midnight, and exhaustion clawed at my skin. The voice in my head reasoned it was just a place to rest, a shower, a bed, and nothing else. But the moment I stepped into the lobby, I knew something was wrong. The clerk, a wiry man with sunken eyes and a face like wax, barely moved when I rang the bell. His gaze dragged across my face and stuck to me like flypaper. "Room 12, he muttered, tossing a key onto the counter with a thud. Don't wander the property at night." The warning should have been my first red flag, but I was too tired to care, muttering thanks as I grabbed the key. The room was about what you'd expect from a roadside dive. Cracked wallpaper, a bedspread patterned with stains, and a lamp that buzzed when you turned it on. I dropped my duffel on the bed and leaned back, letting the thin mattress groan under my weight. Outside, the night was silent, too silent. Even on a rural stretch of highway, you'd expect crickets or wind, not this suffocating, unnatural quiet. My eyes closed, and I must have drifted off, but it wasn't sleep that woke me. It was the sound of something dragging across the pavement. I froze, my heart thudding in my ears. Slowly, I sat up, listening. The sound came again, a rhythmic scrape, like a shovel being pulled against gravel. It was close, too close. I crept to the window, my breath fogging the glass as I peered out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing, just the empty parking lot, the dim glow of the vacancy sign, and the shadow of the woods beyond. Then I saw it. A figure, tall, hunched, and moving unnaturally, dragged something heavy across the asphalt. I couldn't make out much, but the glint of metal in its hand sent a chill up my spine. The thing it was dragging, it wasn't a bag or an object. It was limp, human. I stumbled back, my pulse racing. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. I stood there paralyzed as the dragging sound faded into the woods. When I finally found the courage to step outside, the air was thick with a damp, metallic smell. The kind that clings to your throat and makes your stomach churn. The parking lot was empty, save for a dark smear leading toward the tree line. Against all better judgment, I followed it. My flashlight barely pierced the thick shadows of the woods, but the trail was unmistakable. Crushed grass, broken branches, and that same horrifying drag mark. The deeper I went, the colder it got. Not the kind of cold that makes you shiver, but the kind that settles in your bones and whispers for you to turn back. And then I heard it. A low guttural sound, halfway between a growl and a laugh. It echoed through the trees, circling me. My flashlight flickered, and for a terrifying moment, I was plunged into total darkness. When it came back on, I saw it. Standing just a few feet away was the figure. Its face, or what should have been its face, was covered in a stretched, leathery mask. Its eyes were hollow pits, and its grin, that grin was too wide, splitting its face from ear to ear. It tilted its head, studying me, before lifting the object in its hand, a rusted meat hook. I didn't wait for it to move. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the forest floor. The sound of its laughter followed me, growing louder with each step. I burst out of the woods, slamming into the motel door and locking it behind me. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my hands trembling so violently I could barely hold the flashlight. Then the dragging sound returned. This time, it was outside my room. I backed away from the door, my eyes locked on the crack at the bottom. A shadow passed, and then a sharp, metallic tap echoed against the wood. Tap, tap, tap. It was testing the lock. In a panic, I grabbed my duffel and threw it out the window, crawling after it, As I hit the ground, the door splintered behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I was back on the highway, the glow of the motel's vacancy sign fading in the distance. It wasn't until I reached the next town that I realized the truth. The motel clerk's warning hadn't been about the woods or the night. It had been about the room itself. Room 12 was locked for a reason. I didn't tell anyone about what happened that night. Not the gas station attendant, where I stopped to clean the blood from my hands. Not the cops when I tried to explain why my car was abandoned miles down the highway. Every time I opened my mouth to speak, the words caught in my throat, like my brain refused to let them out. But I couldn't forget it. Couldn't shake the sound of the dragging. Couldn't scrub the image of that thing's face, or lack of a face, from my memory. I should have just moved on, left it as one of those unsolved mysteries that people chalk up to sleep deprivation or too much stress. But something about that night kept gnawing at me. Maybe it was the clerk's warning, or the unnatural quiet of the woods, or the fact that no one, absolutely no one, seemed to have stayed at that motel in years. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I found myself Googling the place, scrolling through pages of reviews, local news stories, and any scrap of information I could find. It wasn't much. The motel didn't even have a name, just a vague listing on some outdated website that hadn't been updated since the early 2000s. But I did find one thing: a forum post from years back, written by someone who claimed to have worked there as a cleaner. "Don't go near room 12, asterisk," it read. "If the clerk gives you the key, refuse it. People disappear in that room. I quit after what I saw. Couldn't stay another night." No details, no follow-up, just those cryptic words. But that wasn't the worst of it. As I kept digging, I found an old news article, buried deep, almost as if someone didn't want it to be found. The headline read, "Missing couple's car found near abandoned motel." The photo of the couple hit me like a gut punch. The man's face was vaguely familiar, balding, middle-aged, with a slight limp. The same man I'd seen on the security footage in the lobby. The one who'd stepped out of that asterisk in the woods without a limp. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Could it have been a coincidence? Some sort of strange, twisted hallucination? No, I'd seen too much. Against every instinct, I made the decision to go back. Not for answers. I doubted I'd get those. But to make sure that whatever was in that room, in those woods, couldn't hurt anyone else. The drive was longer this time. The highway felt emptier, darker. By the time I pulled into the parking lot, the neon vacancy sign was flickering, like it had been waiting for me. The clerk was gone, the desk empty. The place looked even worse than I remembered. Cracks in the walls, windows boarded up with rotting plywood. But the key to room 12 was still on the counter, resting on a layer of dust, waiting. I grabbed it and made my way down the hallway. My flashlight's beam cut through the dark, revealing peeling paint and doors hanging off their hinges. Room 12 was at the end, its door intact. The number was barely visible, scratched into the wood like someone had tried to erase it. I hesitated, my hand trembling as I slid the key into the lock. The room was cold, not the kind of cold you'd get from a busted heater, but a deep, unnatural chill that seemed to suck the air from my lungs. The bed was still there, the same stained mattress sagging in the middle, but the rest of the room, it was empty, stripped bare, like it hadn't been used in decades. I stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind me. Panic surged through me as I whipped around, yanking at the handle. It wouldn't budge. The temperature dropped further, frost creeping across the window like icy veins. Then I heard it, the dragging sound, louder than ever. It wasn't coming from outside this time. It was coming from under the bed. I froze, every instinct screaming for me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The dragging grew louder, closer. Then slowly, a hand emerged from the darkness beneath the bed. Not a human hand, too long, too thin, its nails blackened and curling like claws. It gripped the edge of the mattress, and then another hand followed, pulling the rest of it into view. The figure was the same as before, faceless, grinning, its body twisted and wrong. But now, I could see what it was dragging behind it. Me. It was my face, my body, limp and lifeless, staring back at me, with dead eyes. The room spun, reality unraveling, as the figure crawled toward me, its grin widening. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. But before the void consumed me, I heard the voice of the clerk, faint and distant. "I told you, don't wander at night." I woke up in my car, parked miles from the motel. The key to room 12 was in my lap, and my knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel. I don't know how I escaped. I don't know if I escaped, but every now and then, when I'm alone at night, I hear the dragging sound again. You'd think that driving an 18-wheeler through endless highways at night would make you immune to fear. I mean, I've seen it all. Road rage, accidents, even a guy walking naked on Route 66 like he was auditioning for a horror flick. But what happened last month? That wasn't the usual trucker nightmare. That was something else. Something wrong. I'm hauling cargo across Nebraska, about 2 a.m. The road is a strip of black slicing through miles of flat nothingness. It's quiet except for the steady hum of the rig's engine, the kind of quiet that lets your thoughts wander to dark places. Then, my CB radio crackled to life. "Breaker 19, you out there?" The voice was low, shaky. I hesitated. Usually it's other truckers chatting about routes, weather, or just swapping jokes to kill the boredom. But something in his voice had me grabbing the mic. "Yeah, this is Long Haul. What's up?" Static hissed for a moment before his reply came through. I think I'm being followed." "Followed?" I asked, gripping the wheel tighter. My eyes scanned the rearview mirrors out of reflex, even though I knew the highway behind me was empty. "You sure about that? Ain't nobody out here but us." The radio crackled again, and his voice came through more frantic this time. "It's not a car. I don't know what it is. It's been tailing me since mile marker 240. Every time I look back, it's closer." "Closer? What are you seeing, man?" I asked, feeling a bead of sweat roll down my temple. Nebraska highways don't exactly have streetlights, and whatever he was dealing with was probably some stray animal or a trick of the dark. He didn't answer right away. Instead, there was a long pause, filled only with static, before he finally whispered, "Eyes." "Eyes?" I repeated, my stomach tightening. "Yeah," he said, his voice trembling. "Like headlights, but wrong. Too low to the ground, and they flicker, like they're blinking. I swear to God, man, it's watching me." I glanced at my GPS. Mile marker 240 was about 10 miles behind me. Whatever was happening to this guy, it wasn't far off. "All right, buddy, stay calm. Where are you now?" "Just past mile marker 250. It's still back there, but it's closer. I can feel it." His voice cracked, and for the first time, I heard real terror in his words. This wasn't just highway paranoia. He truly believed something was after him. "Listen," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's a rest stop at 255. Bright lights, other truckers. Head there, and I'll meet you." "No," he snapped, almost yelling. "It won't let me stop. Every time I slow down, it gets closer. I can hear it. like claws scraping the pavement. My blood ran cold. I turned on my high beams, as if that would somehow protect me. "What's your rig?" I asked. "I'll look for you on the road." "Freightliner Cascadia, white cab, red trailer," he muttered. "But I don't think you'll make it in time." Then the radio went dead. I grabbed the mic again. "Breaker 19, you there? Talk to me." Static hissed in response. My heart pounded as I pushed the accelerator, the engine growling as the truck surged forward. I was determined to catch up to him, or at least see what the hell was going on. At mile marker 252, I spotted him. A white Freightliner with a red trailer barreled down the highway ahead of me, swerving erratically. His brake lights flickered as though he was trying to stop but couldn't. Then I saw them. Eyes. Two faint yellowish glows, low to the ground, darting in and out of the darkness behind his trailer. They weren't headlights. They were alive. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, my palms slick against the steering wheel. The glowing orbs moved like they were studying him, stalking him. Then, they shifted focus. To me. I felt my chest tighten as the eyes blinked, slowly, deliberately, and locked onto my truck. Suddenly, the Freightliner veered off the road, its horn blaring in a panicked howl. It disappeared into the cornfields, leaving me alone with whatever had been chasing it. The glowing eyes began to speed up, closing the distance between us. I floored it. My rig groaned under the strain, the speedometer climbing past limits I knew weren't safe for a truck this size. But the eyes kept up, growing brighter, hungrier. The road ahead blurred as adrenaline coursed through me. Then I heard it. A scraping, like metal on asphalt. It wasn't coming from my rig. It was coming from underneath it. My radio came back to life with an ear-splitting burst of static. A voice came through, distorted and guttural, nothing like the man I'd been speaking to earlier. "You can't outrun it." The sound of claws raked across my trailer, and I felt the whole truck shudder. I gritted my teeth, swerving wildly to shake whatever was beneath me. The weight shifted, and I nearly lost control, the trailer fishtailing dangerously close to the edge of the road. Up ahead, the rest stop appeared like a beacon of hope, its floodlights cutting through the darkness. I didn't slow down. I couldn't. The eyes vanished just as I burst into the parking lot, skidding to a halt amid a few other rigs. My hands trembled as I killed the engine and jumped out of the cab. Nothing. No glowing eyes. No claws. Just the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant chirp of crickets. Other truckers looked at me like I was crazy as I inspected the underside of my truck. Deep gouges ran along the metal, like something with claws had been clinging to it. My legs felt like jelly as I slumped against the side of the cab, breathing hard. "Hey, you all right?" one of the truckers asked, stepping closer. I opened my mouth to speak, but froze when I saw it. Out in the distance, just beyond the edge of the floodlights, two faint yellow eyes blinked. Then they disappeared into the darkness. I quit long hauls the next day. Let me tell you something. Long-haul trucking is not for the faint of heart, not just because of the endless miles or the isolation, but because of the things you see at night. I've been on the road for over 15 years, driving through every back road, highway, and nowhere town you can imagine. Nothing shakes me easily, but one night, one stretch of black asphalt made me question everything. It was a clear autumn night when I picked up a late delivery from a warehouse in Kentucky, heading west to Missouri. The load wasn't anything out of the ordinary, crates of furniture, some tools, but the route took me through a patch of the Appalachians that's more shadows than road after dark. Truckers call it the Devil's Backbone. Why? Because people and vehicles disappear there. But nobody ever really talks about it. We just drive. As I crossed into the mountains, the CB radio crackled. A gruff voice, another trucker said, "Breaker 19, anyone rolling through Backbone tonight? Might want to steer clear." Silence. I should have turned around then, but I didn't. Superstitions, I muttered to myself. Besides, I had a deadline to meet. An hour later, the road narrowed. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick trees overhead. My headlights fought against the ink-like darkness. The forest leaned too close, like it was watching. Then it happened. Out of nowhere, a shape darted into the road. I slammed on the brakes, my trailer screeching and groaning behind me. The truck stopped inches from what looked like a deer. No, not a deer. It was too tall, too thin. The thing turned its head toward me, and I swear its face wasn't right. Black eyes, like a doll's eyes, and its mouth, jagged like it had too many teeth. It tilted its head almost curiously before lurching away into the woods. My hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white. My instincts screamed to keep driving, but my engine stalled. That's when I saw the scratches. 3 deep parallel gashes raked across my hood. Fresh, the kind no animal leaves behind. The CB buzzed again, but it wasn't static this time. A low growl came through, like an animal, or a man imitating one. "Still rolling, driver?" A voice rasped, half laughing, half snarling. I was about to radio back, demand who it was, but the air in the cab grew cold. Breath fogged in front of me, though my heater was blasting full, and the forest, so loud with crickets and wind minutes before, had gone dead silent. Then came the footsteps. Heavy, slow, something big, something deliberate. I refused to look out the window, but in my mirror, I saw the outline of something. Something tall, too tall. It stood just beyond the reach of my brake lights, watching. A gut instinct I'd never felt before screamed at me to stay in the cab. The truck finally roared back to life. I floored it, the trailer swaying as I tore through the twists and turns. The further I got, the more the feeling of being hunted lessened. But it wasn't over. 30 miles later, I pulled into a rest stop, one of those desolate lots with a vending machine and a flickering light. Another rig was parked there, engine off, but no driver in sight. I stepped out, my boots crunching gravel, and checked my hood. Those gashes, they weren't just scratches anymore. They were smoking, smoldering like they'd been branded into the metal. And then, from the woods beside the lot, came a laugh. Not a man's laugh, not a child's laugh. It was distorted, like a tape player chewing on a bad recording. The hairs on my arms stood on end. "Driver," the same voice from the CB crooned, but this time, it wasn't over the radio. It was in the air, behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. Just my truck, just the woods. But deep in those trees, I swear, I saw eyes. Not 2, dozens, blinking in unison. I didn't stay to find out what they belonged to. I climbed back into my rig, locked the doors, and drove until dawn. When I finally reached Missouri, the scratches on my hood were gone, replaced by pristine metal, like nothing had ever happened. But I know what I saw. And every time I pass through Appalachia, I see those same blinking eyes in my nightmares. If you're driving through the Devil's Backbone, keep your eyes forward, your windows shut, and don't stop for anything. A week passed, but the shadows of that night followed me. Truck stops felt quieter than usual, the roads darker, and the CB radio, even when silent, felt ominous. The scratches may have disappeared from my truck, but the memory of them burned in my mind. And then, the real nightmare began. My next haul was a routine trip, heading south toward Alabama, a midnight run. As always, I preferred driving at night, Less traffic, more peace. But peace was the last thing I found. It started with my GPS going haywire. One moment it showed a straight route. The next, my truck icon spun wildly, as if I'd veered off-road. I checked my map, recalibrated, and pushed on. That's when I noticed something. The mile markers weren't right. Each marker was different. One read 142, then the next said 666. I laughed it off, thinking I was seeing things. But the markers grew stranger. End. Turn back. And one that simply read run. The rational part of me fought to dismiss it. A prank, bad lighting, or exhaustion. But deep down, I knew better. And then I saw the rig. It was pulled over on the shoulder, headlights blazing. The truck looked abandoned, door swinging gently in the breeze. I slowed, radioing out of habit. "Breaker 19, you need a hand, driver." Static. The closer I got, the more I noticed something wasn't right. The rig's cab was empty, but the trailer doors hung open, swaying like something or someone had forced them apart. What stopped me cold was the graffiti scrawled across the trailer in thick black letters. "Nothing leaves." I slammed the accelerator. My rig roared forward, the abandoned truck disappearing in my mirror. About 10 minutes later, my CB crackled. "You left something behind, driver." A voice whispered, raspy and wet, like someone speaking underwater. "Who is this?" I snapped, my voice shaking. Silence. Then another sound, a scraping, like nails on metal. My stomach dropped as I realized it wasn't coming from the CB. It was coming from the trailer. Whatever it was, it had hitched a ride. My headlights caught a curve in the road ahead, forcing me to slow down. The scraping grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was back there knew I was easing up. I gripped the wheel, heart pounding, until I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled over, leaving the engine running, and grabbed my flashlight. As I stepped out, the night wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket. The air was heavy, too quiet. I circled to the rear of the trailer, every crunch of gravel under my boots echoing too loud. My flashlight beam trembled as I pointed it at the doors. Deep gouges raked across the metal, forming patterns. No, symbols. My hands were sweating, but I reached for the handle. The moment I unlatched it, the doors flew open, and someone lunged at me. I stumbled back, falling hard on the asphalt. It was a man, or what used to be one. His skin was gray and stretched taut, his eyes sunken, but blazing with a sickly yellow light. His mouth twisted into an inhuman grin as he crawled toward me on all fours, faster than any human should. I scrambled back, yelling, "Stay the hell away!" But he didn't stop. His movements were jerky, like a puppet on strings, and his grin widened impossibly as he reached out. That's when I heard it. The sound of tires screeching, a horn blaring, and then the crunch of impact. Another truck coming around the bend had plowed into the figure, throwing it into the ditch. I staggered to my feet, breathing hard, as the driver of the other rig jumped out. "You okay?" he asked, looking me over. I pointed to the ditch, but when we checked, the thing was gone. Only a smear of dark, oily blood remained. We didn't talk much after that. The other driver offered to follow me to the nearest truck stop, and I didn't argue. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but the entire time, I felt those eyes on me, watching, waiting. When I reached the stop, I parked, climbed into the sleeper, and locked every door. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Somewhere out there, in the vast darkness, that thing was still lurking. I never drove through the Devil's Backbone again, and I'll never forget the lesson I learned that night. Some roads aren't meant to be traveled. I glanced at the dashboard clock, 2:43 a.m. The highway was dead, a straight ribbon of asphalt vanishing into the darkness. My CB radio crackled faintly with static, the voices of distant truckers trading stories to stay awake. I adjusted my cap and yawned, the hum of my 18-wheeler lulling me into a dangerous sense of calm. Then, out of nowhere, a voice broke through the static. "Eastbound on I-70. Anyone else seeing this?" The voice was shaky, breathless, like someone who just ran a marathon. I grabbed the mic. "Eastbound here. What's going on?" Static swallowed his reply, but I heard enough to send chills down my spine. "Black semi. No lights. Coming up fast." I shifted in my seat, suddenly wide awake. My headlights illuminated nothing but the road ahead, bordered by skeletal trees and the occasional mile marker. I checked my rearview mirrors. Nothing but empty black. "Anyone else out there?" The voice called again, this time frantic. "Calm down," I said into the mic. "Where are you exactly?" I think mile marker 82. It's behind me." "Oh God, it's right on me." The transmission cut out with a burst of static. My heart thudded against my rib cage. Mile marker 82 was about 10 miles ahead. I pressed harder on the gas, my truck rumbling as it picked up speed. I don't know why I felt compelled to go faster. Curiosity? Duty? Or maybe some primal part of me was already screaming, "You should turn back." 10 minutes later, I reached marker 82. The asphalt gleamed under my headlights, but the road ahead was empty. I slowed down, gripping the wheel tighter. My CB buzzed again, but it was faint this time, almost garbled. "Don't stop." The message made my skin crawl. I rolled my window down slightly, letting in the cold air. That's when I noticed something. The faint sound of a horn, long and mournful, echoing in the distance. It wasn't coming from the highway ahead. It was coming from behind me. I checked my mirrors again. This time, there it was. Far in the distance, but unmistakable. A massive black semi, its outline barely visible against the night. No headlights, no running lights, just a hulking shadow on wheels. My pulse spiked as I grabbed the CB mic. "Whoever's out there, is this some kind of joke?" I asked. But my voice betrayed the fear clawing at my throat. The response came in a whisper so faint I had to strain to hear it. "It's not a truck. Don't stop. Don't let it catch you." The shadow in my mirrors grew larger. It was closing in, fast. I pushed the gas pedal to the floor, the roar of my engine filling the cab. My trailer swayed as my speed climbed past 80, then 85. But no matter how fast I went, the black semi kept gaining. Its horn blasted low and guttural, vibrating through my chest. It wasn't the horn of any truck I'd ever heard. It sounded almost alive. The CB crackled again, and the faint whisper returned. "Don't look at it. Whatever you do, don't look at it." I didn't want to, but when the thing roared up beside me, I couldn't stop myself. I turned my head. The cab of the black semi was empty. No driver, just a void where a driver should have been. The windows weren't tinted. They were black holes, devouring the light of my headlights. The truck's grille was bent into a wicked snarl, like some kind of metal maw. I yanked my eyes back to the road and slammed the accelerator harder. My truck groaned under the strain. The black semi swerved, its shadowy mass brushing against my trailer. Sparks flew, lighting the darkness like fireworks. "Get off the highway," the CB hissed. There was an exit up ahead, barely lit by a single flickering lamp. Without thinking, I veered toward it, tires screeching as I took the turn too fast. My truck wobbled but held steady as I barreled down the narrow exit ramp and onto a deserted country road. For a moment, I thought I'd lost it. The road stretched out empty before me, flanked by fields of tall grass swaying in the wind. My shoulders sagged with relief. But then the horn sounded again, closer this time, and my blood ran cold. In my side mirror, I saw it. The black semi was following me off the highway. "Leave me alone," I shouted into the CB, but the static gave no reply. The road grew narrower, twisting and turning through the darkness. The black semi's headlights, no, the absence of headlights, loomed behind me, swallowing the faint glow of the moon. Up ahead I saw it, a bridge, old, rickety, and far too narrow for 2 trucks. I didn't slow down. If the thing wanted to take me out, it would have to follow me across. The bridge groaned as my truck rolled onto it. Wooden planks creaked and snapped under my weight. I made it halfway across before I heard a deafening crash behind me. I glanced in the mirror and saw the black semi barreling onto the bridge. Its sheer size was too much for the old structure. The wood splintered and the bridge began to collapse. I floored it, the edge of the bridge just a few yards away. The black semi's horn blared one last time, a guttural scream that sent chills down my spine. Then the bridge gave out entirely. I felt my rear tires hit solid ground, just as the rest of the bridge crumbled into the river below. I slammed on the brakes and skidded to a stop, my chest heaving. Behind me, the black semi disappeared into the churning water, its horn fading into silence. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the empty road ahead. The CB crackled once more, a final whisper cutting through the static. "You made it, but it'll be back." I never took that route again. Hell, I've never driven at night since. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't a truck. And if it ever comes for you, don't stop. Don't look at it, just run. It started with a buzzing fluorescent light overhead, one of those that flicker in just the wrong rhythm to dig under your skin. I was midway through another night shift at the 24-hour gas station, just off Route 17. You know the kind, reeking of old coffee, shelves lined with stale chips, and the perpetual hum of the ice cream freezer. That night, a fog rolled in thicker than I'd ever seen, swallowing up the world outside. The highway was nothing but black asphalt disappearing into a wall of gray. I hated working these shifts alone, but we'd just lost our only other night clerk. Guess it was my turn to hold down the fort until corporate hired someone new. It wasn't long before the first weird thing happened. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard it. A faint tapping, like fingernails drumming against glass. It came from the front window. At first, I thought it was just some bug drawn to the neon open sign, but the sound was deliberate, methodical. Tap, tap, tap. I glanced up from the register, squinting through the fog-drenched pane. For a second, I thought I saw a shadow move. "Hello?" My voice cracked, embarrassing me even in my solitude. No answer. Steeling myself, I stepped out from behind the counter and moved closer to the glass. My breath fogged up the pane as I leaned in, searching for movement. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A hand. Pale, long fingers, almost skeletal, reached up and pressed against the outside of the glass. My heart leapt into my throat. I stumbled back, knocking over a rack of potato chips. The hand was gone. I fumbled for the phone, but of course, the damn landline had been out for days. Cell service out here? Forget it. Swallowing the lump in my throat, I convinced myself it was a prank. Some drunk weirdo messing around. But deep down, I knew better. I sat back behind the counter, trying to focus on restocking cigarettes and lottery tickets. For a while, it was quiet again, save for the buzz of that stupid light. Then the power flickered, plunging the store into a brief, suffocating darkness. When the light snapped back on, something wasn't right. One of the aisles, the one with the cheap candy, had been knocked over. candy bars scattered across the floor. No way had that been like that before. I grabbed the flashlight we kept under the counter and stepped into the aisle. My palms were slick with sweat. "Is someone here?" I called out. My voice echoed against the empty shelves. No answer. Then, the freezer door slammed shut behind me. I whipped around, flashlight trembling in my hand. The freezer doors gleamed under the flickering light, their surfaces coated with condensation. Slowly, I moved toward them, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air seemed colder than it should have been, like the chill from the freezers had leaked into the entire store. My breath puffed out in short, nervous clouds. And then I saw it. One of the glass doors had fogged over, and written in the condensation, in long, jagged letters, were the words, "Look behind you." I froze. Every hair on my body stood on end. My throat felt tight, like something invisible was wrapping around it. I didn't want to turn. Every cell in my body screamed, "Don't turn around." But I did. The flashlight beam swept over the empty aisles, shaking as I scanned for anything out of place. There was nothing, just shelves of junk food and energy drinks. The fogged-up window near the entrance. The door I swore I had locked earlier, now standing slightly ajar. A tendril of fog, curling in like a lazy, creeping snake. And then, movement. At the edge of the beam, something darted between the shelves. Not walking, crawling. I backed up toward the counter, flashlight shaking. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. It appeared then, just for a second, peeking out from the corner of the pet food aisle. A face. But it wasn't a face. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin stretched unnaturally tight over bone. The thing leaned out farther, its head cocking to one side like it was studying me. Then it scuttled out of sight, faster than anything human should move. I didn't think, I just ran. I sprinted toward the front door, slamming into the glass, fumbling with the lock. My fingers felt clumsy, the cold making them numb. Behind me, I heard it again, the tapping. But this time, it was everywhere. From the freezer doors, the windows, even the ceiling. Tap, tap, tap. The door finally gave way, and I stumbled out into the fog. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop running. The gas pumps were barely visible through the haze, their lights dim and flickering. That's when I heard the voice. "Where are you going?" It came from all directions, deep and rasping, like someone trying to talk through a throat full of gravel. I turned, flashlight beam slicing through the fog, and saw them. Dozens of them. Figures, crawling on all fours, their faceless heads tilted unnaturally. Their pale bodies seemed to shimmer, half solid, like they were caught between this world and another. They were closing in, surrounding me. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran for my car. The keys were in my pocket, but my hands were shaking so badly, it felt like it took an eternity to pull them out. The flashlight slipped from my grip and rolled away, its beam casting eerie shadows as it spun. I finally got the door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut. The fog pressed against the windows, thick and oppressive, and the creatures were there, circling the car. Their hands scraped against the glass, leaving smears of condensation behind. I turned the key in the ignition, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The engine sputtered once, twice, before roaring to life. The creatures froze, their heads snapping toward me in unison. For a moment, everything was silent. Then they screamed. It was a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard, high-pitched, guttural, like 1,000 voices crying out in agony. They lunged at the car, their hands slamming against the windows, their bodies writhing and twisting in impossible ways. I floored it. The tires squealed as I shot forward, the creatures scattering in the headlights. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove through the fog, the empty highway stretching out before me like a lifeline. Eventually, the fog lifted. The gas station disappeared in my rearview mirror, swallowed by the darkness. I quit the next day. I still don't know what I saw that night. I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I hear it. The tapping. And I can't help but wonder if they ever really let me go. The diner where I worked night shifts wasn't anything special. Just a run-of-the-mill greasy spoon sitting off a desolate highway in the middle of nowhere. Most nights were uneventful, serving truckers, wiping counters, and flipping through an ancient magazine to pass the hours. But that night was different. It started when the clock on the wall chimed midnight, a ritual so mundane that I usually didn't notice it. This time, though, the sound stretched on longer than it should have, like the chime was being dragged, distorted, pulled apart. The fluorescent lights above me buzzed and flickered, sending the room into brief bursts of darkness. I glanced toward the door, half hoping to see a customer walk in and break the eerie silence. Instead, the night outside seemed thicker than usual, the parking lot lights barely piercing the foggy darkness. Then the bell above the door jingled. No one had walked in. That's when I noticed the booth at the far end of the diner. It was occupied. I hadn't heard anyone come in. The man sitting there had his back to me. He wore a black jacket, the kind with a hood, though it was down. His dark hair was greasy and matted, and he sat perfectly still, staring out the window into the nothingness beyond. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't turn around. Great. Another weirdo. I grabbed the coffee pot and walked over, the sound of my sneakers sticking to the linoleum, filling the oppressive silence. "Coffee?" He turned his head slightly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his face. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were glassy, unblinking. "Do you ever wonder," he said, his voice low and gravelly, "what's watching when you're alone?" I froze, coffee pot trembling in my hand. What?" His lips curled into a grin, not a friendly one. Before I could respond, the lights in the diner flickered again. The man's grin widened, and when the lights steadied, the booth was empty. My stomach dropped. The coffee pot slipped from my fingers, shattering on the floor. And then, I heard it. A faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from the kitchen. I stood frozen, staring at the shards of glass and the growing puddle of coffee at my feet. The tapping continued, echoing from the kitchen in the back. Each sound felt deliberate, as if whatever was making it wanted me to know it was there. My mind raced through rational explanations. Maybe it was a raccoon that got in through the back door. Maybe it was just the pipes. Maybe I was imagining things. But none of those thoughts made my legs stop trembling. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. The diner was dead silent now, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and that god-awful tapping. I knew I had to check. As much as I wanted to grab my keys and bolt for my car, my feet betrayed me. I stepped cautiously toward the kitchen, every squeak of my sneakers against the linoleum, sounding like a gunshot in the stillness. The door to the kitchen was ajar, swinging slightly as if it had just been pushed open. The fluorescent light above it flickered erratically. "Anyone there?" I asked, louder this time. The tapping stopped. My breath hitched, and I clenched my fists to keep them from shaking. I stepped through the door and scanned the room. Everything was where it should be. The counters, the griddle, the industrial sink, nothing out of place. Until I saw the freezer door. It was cracked open. I knew I'd closed it. I was sure of it. The freezer was old, and it didn't stay cool unless it was properly latched. I edged closer, feeling the cold air snake out and brush against my skin. The tapping resumed, louder now, and it was definitely coming from inside the freezer. I reached out, my hand trembling as I grabbed the handle. Slowly, I pulled it open. The smell hit me first, metallic, rancid, and suffocating. Inside, the shelves were empty, save for a single object on the middle rack. It was a jar. The glass was smeared with something dark and viscous, and inside a mass of something pulsed faintly, as though alive. My stomach churned, but before I could back away, I heard a voice. "I told you," it whispered, low and guttural. I spun around, and there he was, the man from the booth, now standing in the doorway of the kitchen. His head tilted unnaturally to the side, and his grin was stretched wider than before, exposing teeth that were jagged and wrong. "You ever wonder what's watching?" he hissed, his voice distorted, like static on an old TV. I stumbled back, my foot slipping on the slick freezer floor. The jar fell from the shelf, shattering on the ground. The thing inside spilled out, a writhing, fleshy mass that began to grow. It unfurled long, spindly limbs that slapped against the walls, its surface glistening with a black, tar-like substance. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, as the creature turned toward me, its eyeless face twisted and shifted, its mouth opening impossibly wide to reveal rows of jagged teeth. "Run," the man said, his voice almost gleeful. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted out of the kitchen, through the diner, and into the foggy night. My car was the only thing I could think of, my sanctuary from whatever nightmare was unfolding behind me. As I reached the parking lot, I glanced back at the diner. The windows were dark, but I could see movement inside, shadows slithering across the walls, something too large to fit in that tiny kitchen. I jumped into my car, fumbled with the keys, and finally got the engine roaring. Tires screeching, I tore out of the lot, leaving the diner and its horrors behind. But as I sped down the empty highway, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror. The man was standing in the middle of the road, his grin still stretched wide, his hand raised in a slow, mocking wave. I didn't stop driving until the sun came up, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I quit the diner the next day, but some nights, when the world is too quiet, I swear I can still hear the tapping. It started like any other night shift. The fluorescent lights in the back room of the gas station flickered with their usual irritating hum. I'd taken this job for the quiet. Somewhere I could collect my thoughts while dealing with the odd customer or two, mostly truckers and night owls. I'd been working there for 6 months without incident. That night, though, was different. It was the dead of winter, and a brutal windstorm had turned the streets into a graveyard of fallen branches and trash. I leaned against the counter, scrolling aimlessly on my phone, when the door chimed. A man walked in. His face was shrouded in the shadow of a hoodie, and he moved deliberately, too deliberate for someone who just wanted chips or smokes. Something about him immediately set my nerves on edge. He didn't look at me, didn't grab anything. He just wandered the aisles like he was searching for something. The cameras buzzed overhead. I glanced up at the monitors above the counter. I'd grown used to watching people on those screens. Most were harmless, predictable. But as I scanned the feeds, my stomach turned. There was a glitch in the camera. A second figure flickered into view behind the man. Tall, thin, its limbs too long for its body. Its head tilted unnaturally as it watched him. I blinked hard, thinking it was a software issue. But when I looked back up, the figure was gone. The man finally approached the counter, dropping a pack of gum and a small black notebook onto the surface. I rang him up, barely able to meet his eyes. "You working alone tonight?" he asked. It was a simple question, but the way he said it made my skin crawl. His voice was low, grating, like the sound of gravel under tires. "Yeah," I replied, regretting it instantly. He grinned, revealing teeth that were uneven and stained. He paid in cash, shoved the change into his pocket, and left without another word. But as the door swung shut, I noticed something he'd left behind. The notebook. It was small and weathered, its cover marked with a symbol I didn't recognize. My gut told me to leave it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I flipped it open. The pages were filled with numbers, rows and rows of handwritten code that made no sense to me. Then at the bottom of one page, I saw something that made my breath hitch. "Do not stay until 3:17 a.m. I glanced at the clock. It was 2:48. For the next 29 minutes, I tried to shake it off as some kind of prank. But as the hour approached, strange things began to happen. The lights flickered, longer than usual. The cameras in the corner started to glitch again, showing static interspersed with brief, distorted images of the store. And then there were the noises, soft, guttural whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. At 3:16, the power went out completely. The store plunged into darkness, save for the faint blinking glow of the exit sign. And then, the door chimed again. The chime echoed unnaturally in the silent store. My stomach knotted as the air around me turned cold, like I'd stepped into a meat locker. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to scan the darkness. The aisles stretched out like corridors to nowhere, and the shadows seemed to writhe at the edges of the beam. "Hello?" My voice sounded small, trembling. No answer. The chime came again. The door hadn't opened. It was still shut, but the sound repeated over and over, like someone was walking in and out, or something was toying with me. Then a sound from the back room, a dragging noise, heavy and wet, like a sack of meat being pulled across the floor. My body froze, my breathing shallow. The noise stopped, replaced by a faint clicking sound, like fingernails tapping glass. I slowly aimed my flashlight toward the office door. It creaked open, just a crack, revealing only darkness within. "Who's there?" I whispered, barely audible even to myself. A voice answered, low and distorted. "You should have left." I nearly dropped my phone. The voice came from everywhere, above me, behind me, inside me. I took a step back, my heel catching the edge of the counter. That's when I saw it on the cameras. The monitors, somehow still active despite the power outage, showed the store from every angle, and in every feed, it was there. The thing I'd seen earlier, flickering like a broken signal. It stood impossibly tall, its head brushing the ceiling. Its body was grotesquely elongated, with limbs that bent in ways no humans should. Its face was nothing but a void, darker than the surrounding shadows. It moved slowly down the aisle, its steps silent but deliberate, coming straight toward me. I spun around, shining my light. Nothing was there. Yet on the cameras, it was only feet away. My fight or flight instincts kicked in, and I bolted for the back door. The dragging sound started again, louder now, as if it were right behind me. I reached the door and shoved it open, stumbling into the freezing night air. The parking lot was empty, the wind howling through the trees. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. Fumbling with the keys, I started the engine and peeled out of the lot. The rear-view mirror taunted me. I couldn't bring myself to look at it, terrified of what I might see. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window and sat in my living room, shaking. My phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a text from an unknown number. "You forgot the notebook." My blood ran cold. I didn't respond, didn't sleep, didn't even move for the rest of the night. When morning came, I called my manager and quit. I never went back to that gas station. Weeks later, I saw a news report. A night shift worker at the same gas station had gone missing. The police found the store in disarray, the back room smeared with streaks of something unidentifiable. They never found the worker, or any evidence of who or what had been there. I've kept the story to myself all these years, but every now and then, when I'm alone at night, I hear it again. That chime. And I know it hasn't forgotten me. The evening air was thick with the smell of wet hay and the faint metallic tang of old tools. The wind carried a strange, almost melodic whistling sound that seemed to rise and fall, as if it was alive and moving just beyond the edge of the cornfield. That's where I was, alone on my grandfather's farm for the weekend. He'd left a list of chores, but I was mostly there to keep an eye on the livestock. Easy enough. It started with the chickens. Around midnight, I heard them squawking, not their usual restless chatter, but a frenzied, chaotic scream that shot me bolt upright in bed. Grabbing the flashlight by the door, I shoved my feet into my boots and headed out. The barnyard was quiet, except for the frantic rustling inside the coop. When I opened the door, my stomach twisted. Something had ripped through the chicken wire, leaving a gaping hole. Feathers floated in the air like soft snow, and the floor was littered with streaks of blood. There were no tracks outside, just the hole and the silence. Too much silence. Even the frogs in the pond weren't croaking. I convinced myself it was a fox or maybe a coyote, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. By 2 a.m., the rain started, a steady, cold drizzle. I was lying in bed, staring at the wooden beams above me, when the faint sound of movement reached my ears. It wasn't coming from the house, but from somewhere outside. It was a low, dragging sound, punctuated by wet thuds, as if something heavy was being pulled through the mud. I hesitated for too long before grabbing the shotgun from the rack. As I stepped outside, the rain soaked me instantly, plastering my shirt to my skin. The sound was louder now. It was coming from the silo. The old wooden structure loomed ahead, its weathered planks dark against the stormy sky. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe the rain, knocking loose a tarp. But as I approached, the dragging sound stopped. I swung the flashlight beam towards the base of the silo. That's when I saw it. A figure was hunched over the pile of spilled corn, its arms long and bony, the skin stretched tight over sharp joints. Its back was to me, but its movements were jerky and wrong, like a puppet with tangled strings. I froze, the beam of light shaking as my hands trembled. Whatever it was, it turned its head slowly, unnaturally far, until its face was visible in profile. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth impossibly wide, filled with rows of teeth that looked more like shards of broken glass. It grinned, a thin, split-lipped smile that made my knees buckle. And then it stood. It was tall, too tall. It had to duck as it turned fully towards me. In its clawed hand, it held a chicken, what was left of one. It dropped the carcass, and the wet thud echoed in the silence. The thing started towards me, its movements fluid now, almost hypnotic. I ran. The mud sucked at my boots as I sprinted back to the house. I didn't dare look back, not even when I heard the wet slapping of its footsteps gaining on me. By the time I reached the door, I was screaming. I slammed it shut, bolting the lock and shoving the kitchen table against it for good measure. The footsteps stopped just outside. The porch creaked as it stepped up, and I could hear it sniffing, the sound wet and guttural. Then, nothing. I stayed up the rest of the night, the shotgun cradled in my arms, the flashlight trained on the door. It didn't return. Not that night. But the farm wasn't the same after that. Strange things kept happening. The cows refused to graze near the silo, and I found deep clawed marks gouged into the barn doors. And every night, without fail, that melodic whistling would drift through the air, growing louder as it approached the house. I left that farm the next morning, my chores undone. I never told my grandfather what happened. I didn't have to. When he called me weeks later, his voice was shaking. He said something was out there, something that didn't belong. He never saw it, but he heard the whistling. He sold the farm not long after that. Last I heard, the new owners abandoned it after their son disappeared. They said he was playing near the silo. I know better. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that I left the farm and the horrors stayed there, tied to the land like a bad dream. But things like that don't let go so easily. They follow you. They linger. A few months after I left, I moved to the city, hoping the crowded streets and constant hum of life would drown out the memories. It worked for a while. I even started sleeping better, the image of that grinning, hollow-eyed thing fading with time. Then, one night, I heard it again. I was walking home late, my breath fogging in the chilly air. The streets were empty, the kind of quiet that feels unnatural in a city. I'd just turned a corner when I heard it. The whistling, that same melodic tune, the one I had convinced myself was just the wind back on the farm. I stopped dead in my tracks, my pulse hammering in my ears. It was faint, almost playful, coming from somewhere up ahead. Slowly, I turned my head. The streetlights flickered, casting long, jittery shadows. For a moment, I saw nothing, just empty sidewalks and parked cars. Then, it stepped into the light. It was the same as before, tall, gangly, its skin stretched taut over bones that seemed to shift and crack as it moved. Its eyes locked on mine, black and endless, and it smiled that impossible smile. But now, it was wearing something. A tattered flannel shirt and overalls, smeared with mud and blood, as if mocking the life I'd tried to leave behind. It tilted its head, studying me like a predator sizing up its prey. And then, it began to move. Not running, not lunging, but walking, slow and deliberate, each step a taunt. I did the only thing I could. I ran. The streets blurred as I sprinted, my lungs burning with each gasp of icy air. The whistling followed, growing louder, closer, no matter how fast I ran. I turned corner after corner, desperately searching for someone, anyone. But the city seemed empty, like the world had folded in on itself, leaving me alone with that thing. Finally, I spotted an old church, its heavy oak doors slightly ajar. I dove inside, slamming the door shut and sliding the iron bolt into place. The silence was deafening. For a moment, I thought I'd escaped. Then the whistling started again, just outside the door. It circled the building, the sound rising and falling as it moved, always just out of sight. I backed away, clutching a heavy candlestick I'd grabbed from the altar. My eyes darted to the stained glass windows, searching for any sign of movement. That's when I noticed the shadow. It stretched across the floor, long and spindly, growing larger as it moved closer to the window. Slowly, its face came into view, distorted by the colored glass, but unmistakable. It pressed a hand, if you could call it that, against the window, the claws clicking softly against the pane. And then, it smiled. I don't know what happened next. Maybe I screamed. Maybe I passed out. All I know is that when I woke up, the church was empty, the doors still bolted, and the whistling was gone. but it left something behind. On the floor, in the faint light filtering through the stained glass, was a single feather, blood-stained and torn, just like the ones from the coop on the farm. I moved again after that, farther this time. Different city, different state, but no matter where I go, I hear it sometimes. Late at night, when the world is quiet and the shadows grow long, that faint, mocking tune, carried on a wind that doesn't belong. I don't know what it wants or why it chose me, but I know this: it's still out there, somewhere, and it's still watching. So, if you're ever out in the countryside and you hear whistling, don't follow it. Don't look for the source. Just run and pray it isn't looking for you. It started with a bet. I was bored, drunk, and feeling invincible when I said I'd spend the night out at Widow's Creek Farm. For years, it had been the town's favorite spooky story, the abandoned farmhouse, where people swore they heard voices, saw shadows moving in the windows. Local legend said the owner, Mr. Eldridge, vanished one night, and no one had been able to buy or sell the property since. Something about the land made people uneasy, but I didn't believe in all that. Armed with a flashlight, a folding chair, and a thermos of coffee, I set out to prove everyone wrong. By the time I got to the farm, the moon was low and hazy, casting just enough light to turn the barn and house into black, jagged silhouettes against the night sky. I parked the truck at the edge of the property and made my way to the porch. The wood groaned beneath my weight, the sound echoing in the absolute stillness. Inside, the house smelled like wet rot. My flashlight beam swept over faded wallpaper and furniture covered in sheets. But what struck me was the silence. No crickets, no wind, just nothing. Easy, I muttered to myself, setting up my chair in the front room where I had a clear view of the kitchen and stairs. Just a night alone in an old house. The first few hours passed without incident. I tried to stream music, but the signal was dead. That's when I heard it, a faint thud upstairs. My flashlight shot toward the staircase, catching nothing but empty steps. It's just the house settling, I told myself, though my pulse was already quickening. And then, the lantern flickered to life. It was sitting on the kitchen table, a rusty oil lantern I hadn't noticed before. A weak yellow flame danced inside, casting moving shadows on the walls. I froze. There was no one here. No one could have lit it. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. The lantern flame sputtered as if in response, then settled into a steady glow. I stepped closer, my boots dragging against the warped floorboards. The lantern's glass was clean, the wick trimmed. Someone had been here recently. I turned in a circle, shining my light into every corner of the room, but saw nothing. Then I heard the footsteps. They were coming from above me, slow, deliberate steps crossing from one end of the house to the other. My flashlight darted to the ceiling as the sound moved toward the top of the staircase. "Hello?" My voice was barely above a whisper now. The footsteps stopped. The lantern, sitting on the table just a moment before, was suddenly at the foot of the stairs. Its flame flared brightly, and for a second, I thought I saw something behind it. A shadowy figure, long and thin, its head cocked to one side as if studying me. I ran. I bolted out the front door, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly in the dark. The truck was parked just a few hundred feet away, but as I ran, the air grew thick. My legs felt heavy, like wading through molasses. I glanced back over my shoulder and stopped dead. The farmhouse was ablaze with light, every window glowing fiercely. Figures stood in the glass, tall, thin shapes that didn't move, just watched as I struggled to breathe. And then the barn door slammed open. Something crawled out of the darkness. It was on all fours, moving unnaturally fast, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. I screamed and turned back toward the truck, pushing through whatever force was holding me back. I reached the door, fumbling for the handle, but the thing was right behind me now. I felt its breath, hot, wet, and rancid, on the back of my neck. Then the truck roared to life. I didn't start it. I wasn't even inside yet. The headlights blazed on, illuminating the creature as it lunged for me. It froze in the bright beams, its skin pale and stretched, its face a featureless mask. For a moment, neither of us moved, and then it shrieked, a sound so high and sharp, it felt like needles stabbing into my ears, and darted back toward the barn. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I threw myself into the truck, slammed the door, and peeled out of there, gravel spraying in my wake. In the rearview mirror, I saw the farmhouse lights flicker and die, one by one, until only the lantern remained, glowing faintly on the porch. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back in the safety of town. I told my friends I'd lost the bet, made up some story about the place being too creepy to stay the whole night. I didn't mention the lantern, the footsteps, or the thing in the barn. I should have forgotten about it. Moved on. But last night, I woke up to find a faint yellow glow in my bedroom. The lantern was on my dresser. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The lantern sat on my dresser, its faint yellow flame steady and unmoving, the same lantern I left behind at Widow's Creek. I wanted to believe it was a nightmare, that I was still out there on the farm, and all of this was a fever dream, brought on by fear and exhaustion. But when dawn broke, the light of the flame didn't dim. It stayed just as bright, a constant reminder that whatever followed me home wasn't leaving. I couldn't stay in the house. I packed what I could and drove. No destination in mind, just miles of asphalt and endless trees. The morning air was crisp, but I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something there, the pale, stretched face of whatever came out of that barn. But I was alone, for now. I checked into a motel on the edge of a neighboring town, telling myself this was temporary, that I could figure out what to do next once I got some sleep. But when I opened the room door, my stomach dropped. The lantern was waiting for me on the bedside table. Its flame burned just as steady, casting that sickly yellow glow. I stepped back, leaving the door open, hoping some part of me was imagining it. But when I blinked, it was still there. Something inside me snapped. I grabbed the lantern and hurled it across the room, expecting it to shatter, to douse that damn flame for good. But it didn't break. It landed on the carpet with a dull thud,